The next 3 hours is your chance to participate in a discussion with one of today's leading Civil War historians. Join us as Book TV's In Depth welcomes Gary Gallagher, professor in the history of the American Civil War at the University of Virginia. Professor Gallagher has been active in the preservation of Civil War battlefields and has written and edited dozens of books on the conflict.
Professor Gallagher, in addition to the books that you've edited and co-authored, you've written 6 books on the Civil War. What's the best way to study this battle?
For someone who's in the business, such as you mean? I think the best way to study it is to go to the original sources, to go to the manuscripts, to go to the letters and the diaries that people of the Civil War generation wrote, and then to go to the places where they acted out the war. I think a combination of those two approaches, I think, yield enormous insights into the conflict and into the era.
We have a lot of books that we want to talk to you about, but you brought along 2 that I want to ask you about right off the top. This National Geographic publication that came out in 1961.
Yes, that is an issue of National Geographic that anticipated the Civil War centennial. Came out in the spring of 1961. My grandmother had given me a subscription to the magazine, and I was captivated by the photographs and text in that article, pictures of some of the battlefields, woodcuts, prepared by some of the famous sketch artists of the time. It really caught my eye and gave me my first interest in the conflict.
Why?
I'm not sure why. I was living in southern Colorado. I had no ties to the Civil War. I have no family tie to the Civil War on either side of my family, but something about the images in that article started me on this road, and shortly after that I bought the book that you're holding now, which is the American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War. It came out in 1960. Has a text by Bruce Catton, who I think is the best of all the narrative writers who've written about the Civil War. And that book sealed my fate, so to speak. I became just hopelessly entranced with the war. I loved what are called picture maps in there, done by an artist named David Greenspan, picture maps of different battles. But just some of the images, the black and white photographs from the war, and some of the modern images of the places as they looked in 1960, together with Catton's wonderful text, made me engage the war in a way that I think I certainly never could have anticipated, or anyone who was around me. The Civil War wasn't a big topic in the part of Colorado where I grew up.
One of the pictures is from Fredericksburg, Virginia. How many photographs taken during the Civil War? How new was this technology back then? Well,
the technology wasn't brand new. There had been photographs for a couple of decades before the Civil War, but and there were photographs of the Crimean War. But the Civil War is the first intensively photographed war. I have no idea how many images were taken. I'm sure more than 1 million. Several 100,000 survive, at least. It is a much documented war by photographers, almost all working on the United States side. There were relatively very few photographers in the Confederacy, but it's and cameras could not take action pictures then. But if it's anything that wasn't in motion, the photographers almost certainly photographed it.
In one of the lectures that you'd given, and it's a 48-part series on the Civil War?
With the teaching company, yes.
Well, in one of the lectures, you talk about what was happening March 4th, 1865. President Lincoln is sworn into a second term. The 4th anniversary of the Civil War. 350,000 Union soldiers had died. Another 250,000 Confederate soldiers had died. Where were we as a country as he was preparing his second term?
Well, as a country, we were about to get back together again, or at least go into the first phase of getting back together again. There'd been that enormous loss of life, but by the time that Lincoln was inaugurated for the second time, the war was just about over. Only a handful of diehards on the Confederate side would have thought victory still possible at that point. And in fact, Lee's army would surrender just about a month later, 5 weeks later or so. So it's almost the end of the war, and the process of reconstruction was just around the corner. No one knew what that would look like yet, but it was very near at hand.
I'm going to come back to what led to the war, but you quote Leon Litwack. Who is he?
Leon Litwack is one of the major historians of mid-19th century United States history. He's written about African Americans, he's written about Reconstruction, he's written about, in a broad sense, the history of the United States in the mid-19th century.
And you write about the social convulsions that we were going through in the country. We talk about the battles, but you write a lot about what America was going through, the fabric of the nation. I want to quote you, quote Leon Litwack. None of the great battles, not even Antietam or Shiloh or Gettysburg, compare to the sheer drama with the way in which the Civil War came to be transformed into a social revolution of such far-reaching proportions and consequences. Can you explain?
Yes, I quoted Leon Litwack there in the course of making a distinction between how most academic historians come at the Civil War and how most non-academic historians writing more purely for a popular audience, come at it. For most academic historians, military history is of very little interest. For most non-academic historians, only military history is interesting. I think there's a great divide in the literature on the Civil War, and a divide that I think often gets in the way of full understanding, because I don't think it's possible really to have a sense of the Civil War without having a good sense of how the home front and the battlefield intersected and influenced one another.
You also, in this lecture, said it's long past time that we bring the two civil wars together.
Yes, I think it is. I think it's time that we try to approach the war in a more expansive way, in a way that brings generals and campaigns and battles into the picture, but also brings into the picture politics and social developments, what's going on behind the lines, and more particularly brings into focus how those two, as I said earlier, influence one another. The reciprocal influences of the home front and battlefield, I think, are essential to any real understanding of the Civil War. And I think that's often lost in the literature, lost on the popular side that focuses, I think, too much just on the movements of armies, and whether tactical or strategic, and can be lost in the scholarly literature that often reads as if there were no armies campaigning at all. Either one of those approaches leaves you missing a great deal.
Is that why you said this just about a year ago, that I suspect that many in the non-academic world would be surprised to learn that students can emerge from programs in American history at many good universities without any knowledge of the military side of the Civil War?
I think that's true, and I think it would surprise a lot of people that you can talk about the Civil War without talking about military affairs. But I think that happens at many universities. Just as I think in many books written for a popular audience, you get a sense that the Civil War is only military events. Neither approach is a good way to go, I think.
Was it inevitable that the North would win?
No, it was not inevitable that the North would win. Most people, I think, or at least many people, believe that United States victory was preordained, but it was not. I think that arises from a tendency to begin at the end of the story, to begin at Appomattox with knowledge of United States victory and read back into the war with that understanding. Of course the United States won, now let's go back and see why that happened. It was going to happen, let's just see what the key mileposts along the road were. I think the Confederacy had a very good chance of establishing its independence. I think a better chance than the colonies had of establishing their independence in the war against Great Britain.
From this book, The Myth of the Lost Cause and the Civil War History, you say Lost Cause is an American legend. The war was a mawkish and essentially heroic and romantic melodrama, an honorable sectional duel, a time of martial glory on both sides, and triumphant nationalism.
All of those are elements of how of how many Americans understand the Civil War. Yes, I think that's true. It seems to be a sort of romantic contest, I think, to many Americans, somehow different from modern wars, not as dirty as modern wars, not as brutal as modern wars, and I think that's a terrible misreading of what was going on. It was by far our most all-encompassing, by far our most bloody, and by far in many ways our most divisive conflict, and any effort to try to clean it up and turn it into a romantic contest between Americans who were sadly upset with one another but not really different from one another, I think is a mistake.
I'm paraphrasing in one of your books, but you essentially said that the northern approach to battle was different from the southern approach, in part because in the South they were looking for what I think you referred to as great heroic battles.
Well, I'm not sure I did say that exactly. I think
the Southern view was that
I think many of the Southern, many of the Confederate citizens, and I make a distinction between Confederates and Southerners. They're not synonyms in a Civil War context. Southerners would embrace both white and black Southerners. Confederates are white Southerners on board with the Confederacy, so they're a subset of white Southerners who are in turn a subset of Southerners. I think many Confederates, especially in the first 2 years of the war, wanted their armies to smite the enemy, wanted aggressive victories against United States armies that were moving into the Confederacy. I think they were put off by Confederate generals who tended to act on the defensive, generals such as Joseph E. Johnston. I think one reason that Robert E. Lee became such a towering figure in the Confederacy is because he gave the Confederate people the kind of generalship they wanted, which was aggressive, successful generalship that yielded these flashy battlefield victories.
The cost to the South, you quote James McPherson, the South was not only invaded but utterly destroyed. We talked about the 250,000 Confederate soldiers who lost their lives, many others who were injured. 60% of Southern wealth was decreased, most of it, as you point out, from agriculture. Half of the farm machinery ruined, and 25% of the male population between the ages of 20 to 40 were killed.
Yes, a quarter of all the white military-age males in the Confederacy were killed. It's an enormous human toll. If our losses in World War II, for example, had been comparable as a percentage to the Confederates, we would have had about 6.6 million dead in World War II instead of 400,000. So it's on a completely different scale, and a scale much heavier than losses among United States soldiers as well. The greatest loss in property, of course, came with emancipation. There were $3 billion worth of property in slaves was gone at the end of the war. Slaveholders controlled more wealth than anyone else in the United States in 1860. Property in slaves was worth more than the value of all manufacturers and all railroads in the United States put together. So it's an enormous human and physical loss that the white South confronted at the end of the Civil War.
When you tour these battlefields, Antietam or Bull Run, Manassas, Sharpsburg, what do you see?
Well, I see it's an odd sensation in some ways. What you see on the one hand is a lovely landscape now in many instances. That's certainly true at Antietam, and it's incumbent upon someone giving a tour at one of these places to remind the people on the tour that this is a landscape that would have been hideous to look at within a Civil War context. But what I really see when I'm in those places is an opportunity to convey all kinds of information about the Civil War, not just what the armies did on those sites, but also to move to broader questions about why men went into uniform on each side, what the political context was at that point in the war, why these battles mattered in a broader sense. Why was Antietam important beyond the fact that it's the bloodiest day in United States history? It's not enough to go to Antietam and know what happened in Bloody Lane, or know that the 15th Massachusetts Infantry suffered horrific casualties in the West Woods. It's important to know how Antietam figured in Lincoln's calculation regarding emancipation, how it figured in foreign relations between the United States and Great Britain and France and so forth. There's always a broader context for battles, and that's something that I think is vital to get across to anyone who visits those sites.
Let's talk for a moment about what led to the war, and you say in part the roots begin as early as 1830. What happened?
Well, they begin even sooner than that. I mean, slavery is secession without slavery is unimaginable to me. You often read that it's economics, it's different social systems, it's different this, it's different that. If you take slavery out of the picture, I cannot imagine any scenario within which a group of states would secede. So it's just as it is slavery. Absent slavery, there's not secession. I think that the wrangling about slavery heated up in the 1830s. The Missouri Compromise in 1820 was a signal. It's one of the mileposts, but it did heat up in the 1830s with the beginning of the publication of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, with Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, and it gained steam in many ways through the 1840s with the lands gained from the Mexican War and so forth. So it's a cancer, I think, slavery that's eating at the vitals of the American Republic, that's in place from the time of the founding of the Republic under the Constitution, but I think it becomes a more virulent cancer as you move from the 30s to the 40s and then especially into the 1850s.
And in the 1850s, an author by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe comes out with Uncle Tom's Cabin. You write that President Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe and said, "You're the woman that started the Civil War." But so talk about the book and then talk about the exchange between Abraham Lincoln and Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Well, Uncle Tom's Cabin was an amazing phenomenon. It was published in 1852 and it reached a huge readership. It would be an absolute runaway bestseller now if you multiply the numbers. It sold several 100,000 copies over just the first few months, and that's at a time when there were only 20-some million people in the United States. It was also a great bestseller in England. It had a tremendous impact across the North, and it provoked a tremendous reaction, a defensive reaction in many parts of the slave-holding South. Lincoln, there's so many apocryphal stories about Lincoln. I suppose that he did say that to Harriet Beecher Stowe, but even if he didn't, he could have. So you're the little lady who brought on this great war, or something like that. What that means is that her novel, I think, brought to the consciousness of many white Northerners issues relating to the institution of slavery that might not have been in their minds before that novel came out, and did so in a way that really engaged them at a level that just reading newspapers and so forth probably would not have.
So this all leads up to the 1860 campaign, in which there were how many presidential campaigns?
4 presidential candidates in 1860.
4 different parties.
Yes. Abraham Lincoln was the Republican. There was a regular Democratic nominee, Stephen A. Douglas, and then a Southern Democratic nominee named Breckinridge, who'd been Vice President of the United States under James Buchanan, and then a Constitutional Union Party that ran a candidate named John Bell.
You had southern states like South Carolina saying that if Abraham Lincoln were elected president, we're going to secede from the Union. You write that it was almost becoming the boy who cried wolf because they'd said this so often. How often?
South Carolina had cried wolf often. It had cried wolf in the 1830s. It had cried wolf again in the early 1850s. And now it was doing so again. South Carolina is in a universe of one, and I don't want to alienate people in South Carolina, but you can't say as South Carolina goes, so goes anyone else, because South Carolina was really different. It was too large to be an insane asylum and too small to be a republic, as one observer noted at the time. I think that's a very apt observation. South Carolina was certainly in the forefront of saying that if this Republican, who is running on a platform that says slavery cannot be extended into any of the federal territories, if this Republican is elected, then we're going to take drastic action.
Why did Lincoln win?
Lincoln won because he carried the key parts of the North, and he won the Electoral College. He won less than 40% of the popular vote, less than 40% of the popular vote. He wasn't even on the ballot in a number of slaveholding states, but he carried the large populous, most of the large populous northern states, and won an easy victory in the Electoral College. Even if all the electoral votes of the other 3 candidates had been put together, Lincoln still would have been elected in 1860.
What kind of a campaign was that for those who follow politics? What was it like?
Well, it was unlike what we're used to now. The candidates then didn't go out and campaign the way they do now. Abraham Lincoln did not go out and give speeches. He said, my views are on the record. Look at the record and you'll see what my views are. The only one of the candidates who really went out on the stump was Stephen Douglas, and he did so even in the South. At great risk to himself, great personal risk, in fact. It was quite an amazing campaign on Douglas's part. In the end, it yielded very little. He didn't carry the southern states, the slave-holding states, but he's the only one who conducted anything like what we would call a modern campaign.
Did Senator Douglas and President Lincoln get along in the years that they served together?
Well, they didn't really serve together. They ran against one another in a very famous senatorial election in Illinois in 1858. They knew each other as lawyers and as politicians in Illinois, and I think they got along well enough. I don't think they were pals, but they got along well enough. Douglas had defeated Lincoln in 1858 in that famous senatorial election.
But when he lost to Lincoln in 1860, what was that like for him?
I think it was very hard on Douglas, but Douglas stepped forward and offered to do whatever he could to help Lincoln. I think he behaved impeccably in the wake of that election. He died very soon after the election, Douglas did. He wasn't old. but he died very soon after the election. But before he died, he did make every gesture that you would expect a gracious loser to make toward the winner.
Who do you think was the greatest military strategist in the Civil War, North and South?
The greatest military strategist, North or South, I suppose I would say Ulysses S. Grant, because he operated at a very high level. He ran the whole war for the United States. I think Winfield Scott would be right next to him. Winfield Scott was a great soldier, not much appreciated nowadays, but Scott actually, in April 1861, looked down the road and essentially sketched out the strategy that would win the war for the United States.
And Winfield Scott met with this man, Robert E. Lee, before Lee became the Confederate general.
He did. He did. Scott, as he said, considered Lee to be the best soldier in the United States Army in 1860-61. They're both Virginians. Lee had been on Scott's staff in Mexico when Scott carried out a brilliant campaign from Veracruz to Mexico City. Scott had a very high opinion of Lee and hoped that Lee would take command of the United States Army outside Washington, D.C. right at the outset of the war. That's what he hoped. Made an overture to Lee, and Lee turned him down.
Our phone lines are open, 202-737-0001 if you live in the Eastern or Central time zones, and for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, 202-737-0002. Our guest is author and professor Gary Gallagher, who has written 6 books on the Civil War and edited countless others. We also have a number of emails, one from Richard in San Diego, who asked the question, can you describe your writing, researching process? What time of day do you write? How long? We have an answer to that based on a visit to your home in Charlottesville, Virginia. We'll show you that and come back with your phone calls.
Well, I've written mostly on the Confederacy. I've written some things on the Union, but for the most part I've written on the Confederacy. And being here in Charlottesville, I'm close to the major repositories that I have used my whole life. The Library of Congress is 2 hours away, the National Archives 2 hours away, Virginia Historical Society an hour, and then the cluster of great libraries in North Carolina at UNC, at Duke, and in Raleigh are all within about 3 hours. So I'm about 3 hours from just an immensely large body of unpublished primary materials that are right in my bailiwick. A typical day for me when I'm working on a book is to try to get started early in the morning and get a good 5 or 6 hours in, take a brief break for lunch, and then work about half the afternoon, and then come back that evening to what I've written that day and revise that same day. I revise as I go along.
You're leaning against a standing desk. There's no chair here. Could you tell the story of this desk?
I can. I ran too much when I was young, and I ran my back into decrepitude long before it should have gotten there, and so I've worked at a stand-up desk for almost all of my writing life, nearly 20 years now. And a friend, when I was teaching at Penn State, a friend was visiting. He'd been on a trip to New England, and he said that he had found the stand-up desk that I needed, and he put me in touch with a man who sent me a photograph of this desk, and I bought it, and the man put it in a U-Haul trailer and hauled it down to central Pennsylvania, and I've been using it ever since. I've had it 17 years. It's a wonderful desk, lots of space for a computer and a printer. I can spread lots of books out, and I do still spread books out. I take notes on the computer, but I like to have the actual books in front of me rather than working from sources. The official records of the War of the Rebellion, for example, this huge set, 128 volume set of material on the Civil War. It's available on disc, but I'm not interested in it on disc. I have a set of the volumes, and I like to just spread them out. And here is a piece of the official records. These are for all the Eastern campaigns, which I work with the most. The rest of those are in my office at the university. Southern Historical Society papers, Confederate Veteran, those are major post-war Confederate sources. And then these two bookcases are military campaign studies, pretty much chronologically, just moving on down through the war, ending up at Appomattox down here. And then that little bookcase over there just has a few shelves of things, of reference works that I use constantly. I basically only have to go out of my own study for manuscript materials. I have most published materials, not all of them of course, but most of them I have right here. I can do a great deal just within my own library. Here are general Civil War studies, that is studies that look at the whole war, or at least a big chunk of the war. The next bookcase over is Confederate titles down to there, and then it starts, I have a section on each Confederate state. There's Alabama, and then over here you pick up Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, and so forth. Confederate military memoirs and biography are in the next two shelves here. That's Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. That originally came out in the mid-1880s. Those are reprints, of course. That is articles, it consists of articles contributed by commanders on both sides. That's over here because I ran out of room in the general Civil War section. These are Confederate political, it's Jefferson Davis's works and so forth. These are books on memory and commemoration, lost cause, reconciliation, and so forth. This bookcase and this bookcase are memoirs, sets of letters, diaries written by Confederates. Some of them very hard to find, many of them just articles that I found in scholarly journals and then had bound. That's what things like those are. There are dozens of those, which would be very hard to find otherwise. This bookcase has stuff I've had something to do with one way or another. I don't know if we'll go in. Here we pick up with Union military commanders and accounts, memoirs, sets of letters. Lincoln, Northern politics, Lincoln's cabinet. This whole case is women's narratives and accounts, by monographs, but also most of it sets of letters, diaries by women, mostly Confederate. There are far more Confederate published narratives than Union. That's a real African Americans in the war. There's my tiny Civil War Navy section that reflects about how much I know about the Navy. It's on the top shelf and only part of a shelf, and that's all I need. But foreign affairs are there. This shelf is works on newspapers and newspaper correspondence, the Civil War in art down there at the bottom. Coming of the Civil War over there, Mexican War and more general military history, and then the Civil War in fiction. These are novels and other literary things over here.
And Gary Gallagher, from Penn State to the doorstep of UVA, is there a difference in researching books on the Civil War or your approach to the Civil War?
Well, no difference in my approach to the Civil War. I'm closer to a lot of collections at UVA than I was at Penn State, manuscript collections.
Our phone lines are open and we will get to your calls. The numbers will continue to be on the bottom of your screen. And a reminder, if you want to email us, booktv@cspan.org, Normal, Illinois. For Gary Gallagher, go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. Professor Gallagher, I just had a couple of questions for you. The Richmond bread riots, the psychological effects of the South, the residual effects of slavery. There was a quote by, I believe it was South Carolinian congressman, who stated that Southerners would often lament each escaped slave, yet very few cried out the same way regarding losing a loved one to the quote-unquote lost cause. The psychological effects on the South. Also, history has, I want you to comment on history as it's taught in high schools. Even though I'm all the way back to the line of demarcation, but not just back that far. but the psychological parameters around, say, for instance, the birth of a nation, how the South was portrayed by Griffith. Lincoln sort of was remolded as this fatherly figure to the South.
Thank you, caller.
Well, there's a lot to talk about there. I'm not sure I can remember every part of that. The first part was about the Richmond bread riots in the spring of 1863, when a group of women took to the streets in Richmond to protest the high cost of food, broke into some establishments and looted them. Jefferson Davis came out, pleaded with them to stop, offered them the money that he had on them, and then said that if they didn't disperse, he would fire have soldiers fire on them. That is often used as evidence that the Confederacy was unraveling from within by the midpoint of the war. In fact, it's a rather isolated incident. I don't think it really led to anything. It showed that there were already privations by the midpoint of the war. There weren't a lot of other examples just like that. There was a great deal of disaffection on the Confederate home front. We can maybe talk about that later. But I'm not sure the bread riots really led to anything else. The question about how the Civil War is taught in high schools, I can't really say much about, although I work with groups of high school teachers frequently, both within a classroom setting and on battlefields. There's a great deal of interest among these teachers anyway, with whom I work, about the Civil War, and they seem eager to try to give the best presentation of it possible, to try to bring in as many elements as possible. But since I don't sit in those classrooms, I can't really comment in a specific way on how it's taught in high schools. The one other part of the question concerned Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is one of the two most influential films ever made about the Civil War. The other is Gone with the Wind. Birth of a Nation in 1915, Gone with the Wind in 1939, and both of those films gave decidedly pro-Confederate points of view, no doubt about it, and I think they were immensely influential. I think Hollywood, in its treatment of the Civil War until fairly recently, until the mid-1960s and later, was very pro-Confederate, very pro-South in how it dealt with the Civil War. Even a film such as Santa Fe Trail, which deals with John Brown and the troubles in Kansas and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, it takes a very pro-Southern point of view. The most sympathetic characters in that are Jeb Stuart, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis. John Brown is portrayed quite negatively in that.
Besides the obvious, what led men to enlist to the Union or Confederate armies, especially if you're along the border states?
Well, there's an enormous literature on why men went into the armies on each side, and I think that there are a number of factors at play, and it's hard to decide or to apportion percentages to them. I think that many, as Jim McPherson and others have argued, were engaged ideologically. Many Northern men concerned about saving the Union and all that the Union meant to them, which is hard to convey to people now, how Union could have been a powerful enough concept, idea, to have led hundreds of thousands of men to risk their lives for it. On the Confederate side, they would often say, the soldiers would say that they wanted to defend their homes, defend their way of life, and so forth, which meant Southern society, which meant a slaveholding society in which all white Southerners had a stake, whether they owned slaves or not. Many young men on both sides, I'm sure, joined because their pals were going into the Army. They joined because they got pressure from other people. There are a lot of factors. A sense, if I were a farm kid on a farm in Illinois or Georgia, a mind-numbingly dull, very hard life, and I had a chance to go somewhere else with my friends, get away from my old man who was telling me what to do all the time, I'd join up. I think a lot of them probably went in for those reasons. I think there are many, many reasons that would have prompted young men to go into the Army.
For Gary Gallagher, next call, Pensacola, Florida. Go ahead.
Professor Gallagher, I was wondering, do you think there would have been a Civil War if President Lincoln had not been elected? And do you think he would have been reelected if it hadn't been for the Battle of Atlanta? And what do you think the outcome would have been if there had not been a Civil War? How long do you think slavery would have lasted?
Okay, I should have a pad here so that I can write down the different parts to questions. But the first part, do I think there would have been secession and war if Lincoln had not been elected in 1860? No, I don't think there would have been, probably. Would Lincoln have been reelected in 1864 without Sherman's success at Atlanta? I think Sherman's success at Atlanta and Philip Sheridan's success in the Shenandoah Valley in September and October reelected Abraham Lincoln. I think without those two major, seismic, in fact, victories, the Democrats probably would have won the election of 1864. And the last part I've forgotten. I wish I could remember that, and it was something that was a good question as well. And I don't remember what the third part was.
Were there any lessons that the country, I mean, that we took away from the war? I mean, as we started the Reconstruction process in 1865, 1866.
Well, yes, I think yes, the war settled some things. No one was going to secede in the future. The Constitution wasn't clear about whether secession was permissible or not, but the war settled that. That was settled on the battlefield. No one was going to try to secede again after the war. So the inviolability of the Union, I think, was settled by the war. And of course, the institution of slavery was killed by the war. That was unequivocal. There was no chance that slavery was going to come back, which reminds me of the last part of the last caller's question, which I'll now answer and then come back to your question, and that was, how long would slavery have lasted had it not been for the war? I think there's a fairly pervasive notion that slavery was on its last legs, that slavery was not profitable, that slavery was a dying institution. And the scholarship just does not bear that out. Slavery was a very adaptable institution. It was making the move from cotton and sugar agriculture to the growing of wheat. Slavery was adaptable to industrial situations, as the Confederate war effort very strikingly showed. Slave property was worth more in 1860 than at any other time in United States history. Although it's not a happy thing to contemplate, I think slavery would have lasted a long time had it not been for the Civil War. I don't know how long exactly, but I think it almost certainly would have lasted for several more decades. The United States probably would have been in the very unhappy position of being even slower than Cuba and Brazil to get rid of slavery, because slavery was thriving in the United States. Now back to your question. The war settled the Union, and it settled whether or not there would be an institution of slavery. I also think it settled the question of whether the United States government or local governments would be dominant when you came to the crunch. I think the United States government, the federal government, the central government took a big step forward in terms of power, both in the United States and in the Confederacy, even more in the Confederacy. We can talk about that maybe later. What the war didn't resolve, and what much of Reconstruction and then much of the rest of the 19th century, and sadly much of what 20th century and even present United States history is about, is how does the American democracy work out a biracial, in that sense, and now a multiracial system. It's very difficult, it's complex, and it has been a tortuous road for the United States. That was left unresolved at the end of the war. All right, now there's freedom, but exactly what does freedom mean for 4 million African Americans?
We'll listen to this next call from Chesapeake, Virginia. Go ahead, please.
Thank you.
Professor Gallagher, thank you very much for your interpretation of the fact that when the interviewer refers to the North and South, you refer to the North as the United States, which is most appropriate. Secondly, I have a question in relations to the use of the term Mexican-American War when you talk about Winfield Scott. Correctly so, simply because you don't refer to it as the Hispanic-American War or the Latino-American War. You refer to it as Mexican-American War, which is historically correct. In that case, when the term African-American is used to refer to Afro-Union soldiers, over 200,000 who served in the war to save the United States of America and defeat slavery, why don't we use the appropriate term when we describe the men who volunteered to fight to save the Union as Afro-Union or African, or I would even settle for colored in terms of the fact of the United States colored troops. And lastly, would you say something before the 2.5 hours remaining about the contributions of Afro-Union soldiers during the Civil War? Thank you, and I'll be listening.
Thank you for the call.
I will start with the last part of that, the contribution of the USCT units, the United States Colored Troop units, who numbered roughly 180,000 black men in the United States Army somewhat fewer than 20,000 in the United States Navy. About 9% of all of United States soldiers were African Americans during the Civil War. I think their contribution was very important. It came at a time when white enlistments were down. It was an infusion of manpower at a stage of the war from mid-1863 on primarily, when the Lincoln government needed men. And when the United States had resorted to a draft to bring more white men into service, it was a way to keep the ranks filled in United States armies. And black men acquitted themselves very well on many battlefields. They performed almost exactly the way white soldiers did. Some units were outstanding. Many were competent. Some were not very good, just as was the case with white units. But they contributed in very important ways from mid-1863 on. The comment about my referring to the North as the United States, that's how I see it. It's the United States and the Confederacy. I really see it as two nations. Other people would disagree with me here, but I think the North is the United States. The Confederacy's out of the United States, and then those states come back. In terms of my using African American as a term instead of Afro-Union or some other term, I guess I'm just following the current convention of using African American. I use black soldiers, African American soldiers interchangeably when I write, and I use USCT, United States Colored Troop units, because that's what they were called during the war.
Did the Confederacy have a constitution?
It did have a constitution. It looks very much like the United States Constitution. They wrote it basically with the U.S. Constitution in their left hand and writing their new Constitution with the right hand. It's very, very similar, but with key differences. It very explicitly talks about slavery, which the United States Constitution does not, uses euphemisms. And it also has other differences that underscore the South's political positions in several ways. One of the differences was there was just one 6-year term for the Confederate president, for example, without the possibility of being reelected. There were a number of differences. The key differences relate to its being overtly a slave-holding republic's constitution.
Email from Kathleen Kime of Gainesville, Virginia. Many countries have suffered decades of civil strife without resolution. Why were the North and the South able to form one union again relatively quickly and without too much additional bloodshed after the Civil War?
That's a very good question, and I think that the aftermath of our Civil War is unusual, especially when you consider the scale of the slaughter. I think that one reason that the two sections worked out an accommodation is because there was a broad consensus regarding race in many ways. I think that the North pushed things in terms of freed people to a certain point. I think in many ways the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment were quite miraculous considering what racial attitudes were among white Americans in the mid-19th century. By our standards, virtually all white Americans were intensely racist in the mid-19th century. And without the Civil War, the movement toward what the 14th and 15th Amendments do, and never mind emancipation, I think would have been unimaginable. The war certainly pushed that along. But I think that most white Northerners believed that that probably was enough, and they were not willing to maintain pressure on the white South, especially in the face of considerable pushing back on the part of the white South. The white South had no recourse but to admit that it had been whipped on the battlefield, unequivocally, completely smashed. It's not a decision that's maybe this or maybe that. They are absolutely whipped on the battlefield. They accepted that. But they were very reluctant. They hated having to give up slavery. Most white Southerners did. So they sought ways to maintain racial control, and that is what much of the story of the rest of the 19th century is working out an accommodation between the white North and the white South that pretty much leaves the white South in charge of racial relations in their own area.
You mentioned the term I was going to ask you about later, but Emancipation Proclamation issued September 1862 by President Lincoln. Why then?
Well, the preliminary proclamation was issued on September 22nd, just 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, and Antietam is the key to that. Lincoln had told his cabinet back in mid-July that he intended to issue a proclamation of emancipation, but he was persuaded by some of his advisors that he needed to wait until he had a victory. And Antietam was enough of a victory, although not the kind of victory Lincoln hoped for, but the Confederates retreated. He treated it as a victory, and therefore he issued his preliminary proclamation just 5 days after Lee retreated from Maryland.
Tucson, Arizona, you're next.
Hi there. My name is James. Thanks for taking my call. I'm mostly from the West States, but I did spend
I'm from the West, too.
Yeah. I'm from Washington and California and Arizona. I'm in Arizona right now. But as a younger person, much younger than I am now, I spent some time in Georgia. And in the introduction, they mentioned that you would like to see preservation of the battlefield. Now, I went to a place called Andersonville, which I'd really like to hear you speak about. I'm sure the listeners would too. But for sale in the museum there were Civil War bullets that had been plucked from the ground and the trees and things. And my mom got me one, and I really didn't feel like I deserved it, like as long as I owned it. And I'd like you to talk about Andersonville and just I don't know, is that not taking care of the place? Or?
Well, Andersonville is, of course, the site of the most notorious of the Civil War prisons. You wouldn't want to be a prisoner on either side during the Civil War. There were horrible prisons in the north, Elmira, New York being the worst. A quarter of all the Confederate soldiers who were sent to Elmira died. But the worst of all of them, I think, there's a strong consensus, was Andersonville, where nearly 30%, more than 12,000 United States prisoners died at Andersonville. And the National Park Service owns the site now. It's not only a site that commemorates the Confederate prison camp was there, and that was there, and the ordeal of the United States soldiers held there, more than 40,000 of them from first to last. But it's also a site that commemorates all prisoners of war in United States history. So it's more than just a Civil War site, although I would say it's primarily a Civil War site because of the very strong association that Andersonville has with thoughts about prisoners of war during the Civil War. I think the Park Service does a very good job there.
Why were the conditions so bad, though?
Well, they were bad there for a number of reasons. There was a bureaucratic dimension to it on the part of the Confederate government. I think there's also a dimension there's a mean-spirited dimension on both sides, and there's no sense in trying to whitewash that. There were people who wanted prisoners on the other side to suffer. People in the United States who did, people in the Confederacy who did, and the prisoners did suffer. They suffered a great deal. They suffered, I think, probably more at Andersonville than in any other place, but it's not a huge gap. Salisbury Prison was a horrible Confederate prison. Elmira, as I said, was a horrible United States prison. You would not have wanted to be a prisoner of war on either side. The comment about the mini ball, the bullet, I'm not sure why he felt guilty having that. It's nice to have a tangible connection to a historic event, and mini balls are about the cheapest way to get that with the Civil War. There were untold millions of them made. I think he can have a clear conscience about having one of them. There are lots of them to go around.
But he alluded to something that if you live in this area, you go to Spotsylvania County, Fredericksburg, Charlottesville, you see the tremendous growth. Shopping malls,
absolutely.
Strip plazas, home and housing developments all around many of these historic battlefields.
Yes. You do. In 1987, a handful of us, I was one of the small group in this room, started a group called the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, which turned into a national organization with many thousands of members. The Civil War Trust came along shortly thereafter. The goal of both to protect land associated with the Civil War. They merged later to form the Civil War Preservation Trust, which is doing wonderful work now to preserve Civil War sites. The problem is that many Civil War campaigns were waged around key rail centers or transportation corridors, which are still important places. Washington, Richmond, Fredericksburg, key cities, Atlanta, Chattanooga, Nashville. And these places are growing now, and so there's enormous developmental pressure on this historic ground. You can't save all of it. There's too much of it. People need to live places. They need to work. They need to shop. The key is finding a balance between preserving this historic ground. Manassas is an excellent example, which is under intense pressure from Greater Washington and has seen waves of development come at it over the past 15 or 20 years. It's a very difficult process to protect this ground at many places in the face of development. Spotsylvania is one of the fastest growing counties in the United States and has been for a long time, and there are 4 important battles there. So there's an enormous tension between developers and between preservationists.
Next call from Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm calling because my children and I went to Gettysburg this summer, and we heard a lot about two officers, James Longstreet, who was a general in the Southern Army and who apparently had great reservations about proceeding with the battle at Gettysburg and advised General Lee about that. We heard that he eventually became one of the most hated men in the South because he ultimately took a role in Abraham Lincoln's administration, or a position, I should say. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about him, if you would, please. And the other officer that we heard a lot about was Joshua Chamberlain, who was with the 20th Maine. And I wanted to just I wanted you to address his role and whether it's sort of overly glorified or if, in fact, it was as significant as we heard about at Gettysburg. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you heard at Gettysburg, but Chamberlain and Longstreet get a lot of attention there. As a college teacher, I am very favorably inclined toward Joshua Chamberlain, who was also a college professor, who took a leave of absence to join the United States Army during the Civil War, became colonel of the 20th Maine, and later a brigadier general. He did a good job at Gettysburg in defending Little Round Top. He's become much more visible over the last 25 years or so because of his centrality to Michael Shara's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Killer Angels, his importance in Ken Burns's documentary on the Civil War, and in the cinematic version of Shara's novel, which is titled Gettysburg. Chamberlain is very important in all of those forums, and he has become, therefore, one of the great figures of Gettysburg in the popular imagination. Now, as I said, he did a very good job at Gettysburg, but he didn't stand out tremendously among many other very able Union regimental commanders at Gettysburg. He also he lived a long time, wrote a great deal about his wartime doings as well, and that helped his reputation. So was he a good officer? Yes. Was he as important at Gettysburg as he sometimes is made out to be now? I would say no. James Longstreet, who was a much more important officer on the Confederate side than Chamberlain was on the Union, Longstreet was a corps commander. That is the next echelon down from Lee at Army headquarters. He was Lee's senior subordinate, and he became the focus of a great deal of acrimony after the war. Many former Confederates blamed Longstreet for the defeat at Gettysburg, which wasn't fair. None of the Confederates had a very good series of days at Gettysburg. Longstreet was blamed. Much of the animus against Longstreet came not from what he actually did at Gettysburg, although he dragged his feet and I think was a sullen subordinate at Gettysburg. He didn't have a good day there, a good day on any of the days. But I think much of it had to do with his post-war career. He became a Republican after the war. He took office from his friend U.S. Grant. He didn't serve in Lincoln's administration, but he took office from his old friend Ulysses S. Grant. They'd been great pals at West Point. He became a Catholic. He criticized Lee in print. He did a number of things that alienated former Confederates, and many former Confederates responded by making him essentially an outcast in much of the white South after the war. On the merits, he was one of the key Confederate generals first to last, but retrospectively, he came in for a lot of criticism because of his post-war activities.
We talked earlier about pictures. This is one of the books that you offer an introduction, The American Civil War, 365 Days. As I move inside, there are two pictures I want to ask you about. This is first the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, still under construction, and then further in you can see the U.S. military on patrol, standing guard in front of the U.S. Capitol. My question is what life was like here in this town during the early years of the Civil War.
Well, I think life in Washington during the early years of the Civil War was hectic. There was an enormous influx of people into the city, just as there was into Richmond. Enormous numbers of soldiers in and around the city throughout, extensive fortifications built all around the city in the course of the war, which of course were not there earlier. There would have been an escalation of activity that no one could have anticipated. The very same thing happening in Richmond. Richmond went from being a city of around 38 or 39,000 people in 1860 to more than 100,000 by the end of the war. The government got bigger in the United States, got bigger in the Confederacy, and the capitals certainly reflected that. What Washington didn't see that Richmond saw was major military threats. The Confederacy never really threatened Washington in a serious way, although a little army under Jubal Early arrived on the outskirts in July of 1864 and lobbed a few shells in the direction of Washington. Lincoln went out to Fort Stevens out in far north, the far northern part of the district, and actually came under fire briefly, but that was it. Richmond, on the other hand, was at the center of key military operations.
And of course the Washington Monument construction halts, which is why there's two different types of stone there.
Capitol unfinished, and many people have seen that as a metaphor. The rotunda unfinished at the beginning of the war, completed by the end of the war, showing that the Republic is firm and back together. There are great pictures of the Capitol from the rotunda, of the Capitol with an O, not an A, as you go through the war. It's a work in progress in the course of the war. It's completed by the end of the war.
Next call, Memphis, Tennessee, for Gary Gallagher.
Yes, sir. Thank you for taking my call. At the beginning of your show, you talked about slavery being the start of the Civil War and the reason why they started to fight. What about states' rights with the sale of cotton, the government stopping the South from selling their cotton directly to foreign countries like England and France for the money they wanted to make, and the government pretty much said, no, we're going to buy it from you and sell it at the price and give you the money we want to give you for it. Wasn't that a reason that they wanted to fight?
Well, this is a very frequently raised point. It was state rights. It was not slavery. But of course, the key state right that Southerners were concerned with was the right of their state to interpose its power between a central government that might tamper with slavery and slaveholders who owned slaves. I'm not sure where you're getting your information about the government not allowing people to sell cotton. Cotton was the great export of the United States all through the late antebellum years. A bumper crop had been shipped from 1859. There was the United States government certainly did not prevent cotton growers from shipping their cotton abroad. English textile manufacturers, it was the key manufacturing element in Great Britain in 1860. They were utterly dependent upon cotton from the United States. The French also imported cotton from the United States. It was the war that brought a great change in where those supplies of cotton came from. Indian cotton, Egyptian cotton, they zoomed up in the course of the war because Southern cotton was denied to Great Britain and France as a policy of the Confederate government, incidentally, not of the United States government. It wasn't an official embargo on the part of the Confederacy, but it was a de facto embargo.
BookTV@cspan.org is our email address, and our phone lines will continue to be open for Gary Gallagher, who will be with us for another 2 hours. Paul from New Hampshire says, please ask Professor Gallagher if he thought anything important was omitted from the Ken Burns Civil War documentary.
I think Ken Burns did a very good job in his documentary. He was assailed from both sides. Some people saying there's way too much about slavery in this. There's not enough military, and from the other side it's nothing but one general after another and one lingering shot on a battlefield after another. I think Burns walked a very tough tightrope in that series, putting together a documentary that would appeal to a broad audience while at the same time touching as many bases as possible. I think the fact that he came in for criticism from virtually every direction suggests that he did a good job. I think that it would be hard to do a much better job than he did. I found it to be a very engaging and moving treatment of the Civil War. Did he do everything? No, he didn't. Did he end on perhaps a little too high a note? I think maybe he did. He ended on a reconciliation note, everybody getting back together, the old veterans shaking hands over the wall at Gettysburg and so forth. It doesn't really give a sense that 12 years of turmoil that is 3 times as long a period as the actual war took, would come with Reconstruction, and that there was so much left to work out, so much animosity and acrimony still present in the land. He could have done a better job with that, I think, but overall I think he did a first-rate job.
Next call, Toledo, Oregon. Go ahead.
Good morning, Professor Gallagher. Hey, after seeing all your books there on TV, I figured you'd be the man to ask. I read a while back that there was only one United States Army general ever killed in action, and that was Major General Canby in the Modoc War. Can you tell me of any others? You might know. Thank you.
Yes, what United States Army generals killed in action. James B. McPherson was killed in action in the Battle of Atlanta in 1864, so there's at least one more. And on the Confederate side, Albert Sidney Johnston, as you probably know, was mortally wounded at the Battle of Shiloh, so there's another one. I'm not an expert on all the United States generals killed in battle throughout United States history, Army commanders, I mean, but there are 2 more Army commanders who were killed in battle.
Another email from a viewer in Columbia, Maryland, Dennis Conroy, who says, is there a difference teaching in the South now at UVA compared to the North at Penn State?
That's a question I get often, are there regional differences in teaching the Civil War? I've taught the Civil War at the University of Texas just one time, and then many years at Penn State, and now many years at the University of Virginia. I teach it exactly the same way. I mean, I change my course every year because I learn more as I go along, and so I change my course a little bit, but I don't change my teaching style or the content because of where I'm teaching, and I have found that there are far more similarities between the attitudes that students bring to class concerning the Civil War than there are differences. Similarities between students at Penn State, students at the University of Virginia, students at the University of Texas. Far more similarities than differences, although there are more students at the University of Virginia, for example, who have ancestors who fought in the Confederate Army and who will come having heard from an uncle or a grandfather or a father or someone that it was all about state rights and not about slavery. I got some of that at Penn State. I get more of that at the University of Virginia, but I think that that's a fairly pervasive notion in many parts of the United States, this effort to play down slavery, and you just can't do it.
One of those students, Deb Davenport, who works here at this network, had asked me to ask you the question, why were the terms of the settlement of the war so lenient?
Well, Lincoln wanted it that way. Lincoln met with his principal generals. He met with Grant and he met with Sherman, and he said that he wanted an easy end to this war. And that is what Grant did at Appomattox. He conveyed the terms that Abraham Lincoln wanted him to convey, and I think Lincoln had an enormous appreciation for the scale of the slaughter. His second inaugural address, I think, is by far the best political speech in our history, by far. I don't think there's anything even close. And if you read that, you have a sense of how Lincoln viewed this as a war that left no one with their hands clean. It was a war with guilt enough to go around, North and South, and I think he was hoping to move beyond that. It was also a speech that put slavery at the center of things. He said everybody knew that somehow slavery was the cause of the war, and that there was guilt to go around, and that the blood had been shed in profusion to expiate that guilt, and now let's try to get beyond that. That's what he conveyed to Grant. That's what Grant offered to Lee, and that's what Lee accepted. It is amazingly easy considering the scale of the slaughter. No major reprisals, no wide-scale hangings, no show trials beyond just a handful. It's a very different ending to a huge civil war than you would usually see in world history.
We've heard from President Bush currently that he wants the generals to do the job in Iraq. We heard in history that President Johnson often dictated where some of the bombings would take place in Vietnam. What was the relationship like between Lincoln and General McClellan or Grant and others who served? And how involved was he in the military strategy?
Oh, Lincoln was very involved, but what he was doing was looking for a general who would win the war. And so I think he became involved to a greater extent if he was dealing with a general who, by his reckoning, was not winning the war. And George B. McClellan would certainly fit into that category. I think when he found Grant, when Lincoln found Grant, he gave Grant a great deal of latitude. He let Grant He still would intervene in some ways, but he gave Grant a pretty free hand once Grant became General-in-Chief in March of 1864, and Grant rewarded him by putting together a strategy that did, in fact, win the war.
We'll talk about Robert E. Lee in a moment, but Madison, New Jersey is next for Gary Gallagher.
Hi, Dr. Gallagher. It has to do with military history. I know that Joseph Johnston did a great job in defending Atlanta in his retreat action, but if Albert Sidney Johnston had not died at Shiloh, would the Civil War taken a different turn? And also Stonewall Jackson, if he had not died at Chancellorsville and had been Lee's right-hand man at Gettysburg, which was just 2 months later instead of Longstreet, would he have advised a Pickett's charge or something like that? And also at Antietam, the plans that were around the Three Cigars that one of McClellan's aides found, had McClellan followed through and believed that the plans were genuine, would Lee had not even had a chance to invade Pennsylvania in July of 1863. Thank you, Dr. Gallagher.
Thank you for the call. Since you've written the questions down, let me ask you first about Chancellorsville and this book. What happened in that battle?
Well, Chancellorsville, I think, is Lee's tactical masterpiece. It was fought in early May 1863. It was a victory for Lee's Army of Northern Virginia over the Army of the Potomac, which was commanded by Joseph Hooker. In that campaign. It's a battle that Hooker should have won. Hooker made a very good start on the campaign. He got around Lee's left flank. He came in against Lee's rear, but then I think he lost his nerve. Hooker did. And he gave Lee a chance to seize the initiative, which was an enormous mistake. You shouldn't let Lee do that. Lee always was seeking to do that. And in the end, Lee and Stonewall Jackson reached the apogee of their fabled collaboration in this battle. A famous flank attack by Jackson on May the 2nd, which routed one Union corps. Still shouldn't have won the battle, but because Hooker allowed them to maintain the initiative, in the end Lee was able to succeed. Jackson shot down by some of his own soldiers on the night of May the 2nd. His arm was amputated and he died a few days later down at Guinea Station in Virginia. So it's an important battle because it's a flashy victory for Lee. It's a battle that costs Lee his most famous lieutenant, together with James Longstreet, one of his two best lieutenants. But even more than that, I think it's a critical battle because I think it completes the process that unfolded between late June and early May, late June 1862 and early May 1863, when Lee forged the Army of Northern Virginia into a spectacular war-making instrument, and when he also forged a bond between himself and his soldiers that was unrivaled elsewhere in the Civil War. I would say elsewhere in United States military history. And I think that Chancellorsville completed that process. On the morning of May the 3rd, Lee and his men both had an epiphany, I think, an enormous outpouring of emotion on both sides as they came together to achieve success against Hooker.
Your doctoral thesis was on Robert E. Lee. Why?
No, I wrote my dissertation on a subordinate of Lee's, a young officer named Stephen Dodson Ramseur, and I picked him because he left several hundred letters that no one had ever really looked at, and it was a chance for me to look at, to write a case study, really, of the development of subordinate commanders in the Army of Northern Virginia, and to look at this young officer as typical of his cohort of white Southerners who supported the Confederacy, ardent Confederate nationalists, deep animosity toward the United States in many ways, toward the North, I should say, even though he was a West Pointer and had had some Northern friends at West Point. So Ramseur let me get at some things that interested me in a broader sense, but primarily that was a fairly conventional study of a young officer and how he fit, how he showed what kind of young commander would profit in Lee's army, who would get ahead. He was aggressive, risk-taking, which Lee liked, and he moved up very rapidly. He moved from being a very junior officer early in the war to being a two-star general in the autumn of 1864 when he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Cedar Creek.
Speaking of mortally wounded, two photographs, one of many in your book on Stephen Ramseur, faces of those who were killed.
Yes, those are two famous death studies of two of Ramser's men killed during the fighting at Spotsylvania, fighting at a place called the Harris Farm on May the 19th. These are the kinds of views that Americans had never seen before the Civil War. They'd always had their image of the war from woodcuts and heroic paintings where long lines of soldiers with flapping flags and brave officers out in front were contending. These kinds of photographs brought the true carnage of the war back to the northern home front particularly.
Denver is next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Professor Gallagher. I have two quick questions. First of all, the strategy and tactics used by both the Union and the Confederacy have some impact on strategy and tactics that were adapted for World War I. I'd like to get your comments on that. And then also, since we're talking about the West a little bit, the battles like the Battle of La Glorieta Pass in Colorado, were any of the battles in the West have any long-term impact on the success of the Confederacy? Had they gone a different way?
Well, I'll start with the second part. Glorieta Pass is the closest battlefield to where I grew up. I grew up in extreme southern Colorado. I could get to Glorieta Pass. I wouldn't know what I was looking at when I got there because it's not marked. But it's the closest I could find. Did it or Valverde or Apache Canyon or any of the other skirmishes in New Mexico have much to do with the outcome of the Civil War? No, they did not. They were on a very small scale. They're not on the periphery. They're beyond the periphery of the Civil War. So they're interesting to read about, but I don't think they had much of an impact in any way. They did yield one of the earliest Civil War monuments. If you go to the square in Santa Fe, there was a monument erected just a couple of years after the war that's one of the earliest Civil War monuments. So it's interesting to look at. May I come back? And we skipped the caller just before this caller who had 4 questions, and I don't want him to feel slighted. He asked me about Joe Johnston and Albert Sidney Johnston and Stonewall Jackson and Antietam. And I'll answer them very quickly, and I'll go in reverse order. I think that McClellan, he asked about McClellan's getting a copy of Lee's orders during the Antietam campaign. I think almost any general but McClellan would have done a great deal more with those orders than McClellan did. I think he knew they were genuine, and yet he let precious time go by before he did anything. It's a perfect example of McClellan's not wanting to risk anything. Every army has an institutional culture of command, and McClellan instilled in the Army of the Potomac a very cautious culture of command, and it was a pernicious thing that he did that remained in place to the end of the war. Even Grant couldn't really root it out. And Antietam and his handling of those of that copy of Lee's Special Orders number 191 is a perfect example of how he wouldn't risk anything. He just was very cautious. What would have happened if Stonewall Jackson had been at Gettysburg? I always wonder when that question will come up. It always comes up, and of course we can't answer what would have happened. He would have been dead for 2 months for one thing. He wouldn't have had much of an impact. That's not a serious answer. He probably would have pushed more at the end of the first day at Gettysburg. Whether he would have succeeded or not, where Ewell didn't, who knows. Albert Sidney Johnston, what if he hadn't been mortally wounded at Shiloh? Johnston hadn't been doing terribly well to that point. Whether he would have grown in command, we don't know. The war would have gone differently, but just how, I'm not sure. And as for Joe Johnston, the caller said that Johnston did a great job of waging a defensive war in the early stage of the Atlanta campaign. I'll just have to respectfully disagree. I have very low regard for Joe Johnston. I think Johnston was a horrible subordinate to Jefferson Davis. I don't think he ever told the president what was going on. I think he was always looking for a place to retreat to. I don't think he understood the Confederate people, and I think there was enormous sympathy to get rid of him by mid-July when Davis finally got rid of him. He retreated from Chattanooga to Atlanta without fighting a great deal, and I think many Confederates, whether rightly or wrongly, believed that he'd given up too much too easily, just as they believed he'd done the same thing when he retreated up the peninsula toward Richmond in 1862.
We have a couple of photographs I want you to respond to. First of all, your son, Will, does he have the same passion for the Civil War?
No, he does not. Will is a good sport. He's tolerated my passion for the Civil War, and we went to battlefields together when he was a young... There we are, on battlefields together. Will's about 12 there. We're up on Marie's Heights at Fredericksburg, leaning against the same cannon. Will's a photographer in Austin, Texas. Now, that picture of me is probably the first photograph I have that Will actually took. He and I have talked about doing a book together where he will do photographs, modern photographs of places associated with the Civil War that will be key to my text, and I hope we're able to pull that off.
What about your parents? Did they instill this love for you?
No one instilled this love for me in the Civil War. My parents did not. My son didn't really abet it. I had a couple of people I knew, one lawyer and one, those were my parents in Ireland, actually. They were tolerant of my interest as well. And I was able to make a trip. My job on the farm where I grew up was to irrigate. My father allowed me to take a break from that in the summer of 1965, and my mother and my grandmother and I drove from Colorado through the South up to Gettysburg. Our high water mark was at Gettysburg, just as many people say Lee's was. We drove to Gettysburg and back in 12 days and saw a great number of sights along the way. The grandmother who went with me, my mother's mother, her name was Rose Gray, she actually encouraged me as much as anyone. She started buying books, Civil War books for me when I was very young. My folks then did as well when it was clear that that's what I wanted more than anything else. But my grandmother, she would listen to me talk about the Civil War. I don't think she really had much of an interest in it either, but she would listen, and she did buy me books, which was great from a very early time.
First Sunday of every month here on C-SPAN 2's Book TV, we spend 3 hours in depth with respected authors. Today, Gary Gallagher. Upper Marlboro, Maryland is next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Professor Gallagher. I'd like to know your views or opinions on why there is so little attention/recognition given to notable white Americans who were responsible for the expansion of civil and human rights during and after the Civil War, like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stephenson. I've noted that there appears to be little or no books or monuments dedicated to these folks celebrating their accomplishments. I'm amazed that it took me literally 5 years or so to run down just a used copy of Donald Davis's biography on Charles Sumner, and I just find that to be strange that we can't find any information regarding these folks.
Well, there's actually a fair amount of scholarship on you mentioned Stevens and Sumner. David Donald's, the first volume of his two-volume biography of Sumner, which is a beautifully done piece of work, won the Pulitzer Prize for biography. The second volume, the larger one, came out later and also did fairly well. I think Thaddeus Stevens has been the subject of a number of biographies, the most recent of which is still in print from the University of North Carolina Press. I think that relative to interest in the military side of the Civil War, for example, there has been less attention to the senators and governors and others who pushed along the civil rights agenda, men such as Stevens and Charles Sumner. Reconstruction, I think, has never garnered anything like the attention that the Civil War does. It's very complex, it's very hard to understand it, and there's not this sort of opportunity to make a heroic, linear story of it as there is with the Civil War. So I think that's probably part of the reason why you don't have as many biographies of Thaddeus Stevens as you do of U.S. Grant or of Robert E. Lee or of Stonewall Jackson. But there are very good studies of both Sumner and Stevens and of other figures such as Benjamin F. Wade and other of the radicals who pushed along the emancipation agenda in the course of the war.
Let me ask you about a couple of other key players. First of all, Philip Sheridan, Union General. Who was he?
Philip Sheridan was part of the triumvirate of Union commanders who won the war, essentially, and who were the three top heroes of the war when it was all over. U.S. Grant at the top, of course, William Tecumseh Sherman as his #1 subordinate, but Philip Sheridan would have been right behind Sherman. Sheridan began the war at a much lower level. He fought out in the West with Grant. He fought both with the cavalry and with the infantry, was a division commander of infantry in the West, but then came east with Grant in the spring of 1864, first commanded the Cavalry Corps in the Army of the Potomac, and didn't do that well, quite frankly, at the Wilderness in Spotsylvania, but then was given command of an army in the Shenandoah Valley that defeated Jubal Early's Confederate army in the valley in what was called the Second Valley Campaign in the autumn of 1864, and it was on the basis of that enormous success on his part that helped re-elect Lincoln, and then very stalwart service in the Appomattox Campaign that made Sheridan one of the great Union heroes of the war. After the war, Grant was General-in-Chief of the Army, followed by William Tecumseh Sherman. He, in turn, followed by Philip Henry Sheridan.
And you talked about him earlier, one of the Confederate generals, James Longstreet.
Longstreet is, I think, one of the two best corps commanders in the Confederate Army. He and Stonewall Jackson are the two best. I mean the whole Confederate Army, not just Lee's. And he was a very good soldier. His reputation called into question, as we talked about earlier, by writers in the Lost Cause tradition who used him at Gettysburg as a way to get Lee off the hook for the defeat at Gettysburg. Longstreet didn't have good days at Gettysburg, neither did Lee. But overall, Longstreet was a superior subordinate. Now, I don't think he would have made a good Army commander. There's no evidence of that. He did very poorly in independent command in East Tennessee in the winter of '63 and '64. But Lee always relied on him. Lee called him my old war horse. He's one of only two men that Lee gave an affectionate nickname to during the war. Jubal Early was the other one. But Lee liked Longstreet. He pitched his tent with Longstreet. I think he enjoyed Longstreet's company. I think in terms of their personal relationship, he was closer to Longstreet than he was to Stonewall Jackson.
Next call, Boise, Idaho. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. My question concerns George McClellan and how he began so beloved by the Army that Lincoln hesitated to fire him, to losing to Lincoln largely because of the Army not supporting his candidacy. Could you account for that change? Thank you.
Yes, that's a great question. I think George McClellan came the closest of all the United States commanders to developing the kind of bond with his men that Lee developed with the men of the Army in Northern Virginia. The rank and file of the Army of the Potomac loved George McClellan in a way that they loved no other commander during the war. Certainly not Grant, not Meade, not Hooker, not Burnside, not any of them. It was, in many real ways, McClellan's Army first to last. I don't think we can understand the Army of the Potomac unless we understand McClellan's long-term influence with it. So you have that on the one hand. On the other hand, you have a very large percentage of the soldiers who voted in 1864 voting for Lincoln rather than for George B. McClellan, who was the Democratic candidate. And I think the explanation for that is that these men, whatever their personal feelings for McClellan, saw that so much blood had been invested in this war to that point. They'd seen so many comrades killed, maimed. They'd been through so much to save the Union that they were of a mind to support the candidate who unequivocally wanted to push through to victory, and that was Lincoln. Although McClellan also said that he wanted to, that Union had to come as the end, as the principal end of the war. Lincoln was the much stronger war candidate, and I think the soldiers voted to finish the work that they'd invested so much blood and toil in.
In this book in which you talk about writing the Civil War, it's one of a series of essays that is published in the quest to understand what happened. You asked the question, did the North win because of sound strategic planning and execution, or would the Confederacy have lost in any event because it struggled against impossible odds?
And my answer to that is that the United States won in the end because of sound strategy and execution. It's not enough to have more of everything. The United States had about 2.5 times the military manpower pool that the Confederacy had. It had far more industry than the Confederacy had, though the Confederates built a very impressive war industry in the course of the conflict, but it's not enough to have those advantages. The United States had them throughout the war, and they weren't winning the war. At many points. You needed the right commanders in place, and the team that proved to be equal to the task was Abraham Lincoln, overseeing the civilian side, and Ulysses S. Grant in charge of the United States armies. You need the resources plus the right leadership, and the United States found that, happily, when Ulysses S. Grant was promoted to General-in-Chief of the armies. Great Britain, relatively, was far more powerful vis-a-vis the colonies than the United States was vis-a-vis the Confederacy, and yet Great Britain lost our Revolutionary War. I think the United States could have lost the Civil War. I think there could have been an independent Confederacy, but Grant, with Sherman and Sheridan and others playing key supporting roles, and Lincoln saw to it that the United States resources, in the end, told.
Our guest is Gary Gallagher, who has written or edited more than 25 books on the Civil War. He is currently a professor at the University of Virginia, and our next call is from Troy, Alabama.
Please indulge me for just a moment. I'd like to thank C-SPAN. I've had this phone to my ear for the last 25 years trying to get through to C-SPAN, and I finally made it.
Well, we're glad. Take your time then.
Okay, so I might step on my tongue
There
a
may
little
be
bit.
a lot of pent-up questions here.
Yes, sir. First of all, I'd like to thank C-SPAN for, I'm about a half-literate person, not because I'm from Alabama, but because I've been watching TV for so long I've forgotten how to read. But thanks to C-SPAN, you have really elucidated my mind a little bit more. Your voice is very familiar to me, Dr. Gallagher, because I've been listening to your great course series, which should be commended, particularly your Robert E. Lee thing. Don't have any questions about that, but I'd like to ask you this. I'm very impressed by the size of your library. Now, God forbid if your library ever caught on fire, what would be the first 4 books that you would grab that would be indispensable to you?
What would the first 4 books that I would, you know, I don't think I can answer that. I'm not sure. They may be the 4 that I could get closest to. I do have favorites. I love writings by people who participated in the war, and I might grab, I'll give you a list of 4, although tomorrow I might give a different list. I'd probably grab Porter Alexander's reminiscences, probably grab U.S. Grant's memoirs, grab Kate Edmonston's journal, which I think is wonderful, and then I might, if I had time, take Bruce Catton's American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War with me, although I could always find another copy of that.
Caller, since it's taking you 25 years, do you have another question?
I'm so scared right now I'm going to have to hang up. But thanks a lot. One other thing, Dr. Gallagher. James McPherson, the professor, consented to answer some questions for our local Civil War forum by telephone. Is there any way we could hook up with you?
I think I didn't consent to do that, if I remember. Didn't I get something from you, an email from you?
Well, not from me, but from
I got one from somebody.
Another fellow named Dr. McPherson. But we would certainly be interested in having you talk to us.
Well, we can talk about that. Send me an email.
You have a good one. Appreciate your good work here.
Thank you, caller. Don't be a stranger. Don't wait another 25 years to call in. We have a number of emails. They're stacking up. Wesley Joyner, who is a second-year graduate student, he's aspiring to get his Ph.D. in history. He said he's very interested in the Civil War, but considering the immense amount of literature on the subject, I feel like it might be extremely difficult to produce original, cutting-edge material in the field.
A number of people say that. The field has expanded enormously over the past 25 or 30 years, and it continues to expand. I think that is, I think the opportunities are almost unlimited. All it takes is a little imagination on the part of the student, and I think anyone who really engages the war in graduate seminars or colloquia and talks to other people interested in it will find many avenues of research that would be fresh. So if that's what's putting him off, I think he can put his mind at ease about that and just go ahead. There's a lot of work being done, very good work. And I see no slackening.
2 emails that are related. Manny emails, what were the positions of the European countries during the Civil War? For instance, did France, England, Poland, etc. send generals or troops to fight on either side? And then Eric Johnson from California says, what were the main factors that ultimately kept Great Britain from entering the war on the side of the Confederate States, or for that matter, the Union?
No European power sent formal military units to fight on either side, although a number of individuals from various countries ended up fighting for each side. Sometimes they went as observers, sometimes they actually took commissions. There were British officers, there were some French officers who did that, some Prussian officers who did that. So there are a number of Europeans present with the armies, but there's no commitment of troops. official commitment of troops from any European nation on either side. The attitude of the Europeans toward the war, I think they saw it as a potential opportunity for them to further their own goals in some ways. I think the French especially did. The French used the war as a pretext to establish a puppet regime in Mexico, for example. They installed Maximilian on the throne as Emperor of Mexico. The Confederacy said that was fine with them, and they would recognize Mexico. If France would recognize the Confederacy, that would have worked out, except that France would not act unilaterally. It would only do what Great Britain did, and Britain in the end decided it was not in the British interest to get involved seriously in the war. The two principal reasons for that, I think, are that the British never were convinced the Confederacy was going to win the war, and I think that's when they would have come in. They would have backed a winner. I think they came close one time. They came close. Another reason the Battle of Antietam is so important is that it was a watershed in terms of British attitudes toward whether or not they should intervene in any way in this American conflict. I think in the wake of Lee's successes at the 7 Days and Second Bull Run, the British were edging toward trying to mediate an end to the war, but Antietam caused them to back away from that. And emancipation, once the United States was firmly on board with emancipation, that also made it much more difficult for either Great Britain or France, both of which had gotten rid of slavery in the decades before the Civil War, to come in on the side of the Confederacy.
We are at the halfway point of a 3-hour conversation with Gary Gallagher. More of your calls and emails in just a moment. But the Book TV bus traveling in Des Moines, Iowa, asked folks in that town about the Civil War, and one of the questions, you alluded to part of it on World Opinion. Let's listen to the question and get your response.
Hi, I'm Boris Wolfson. I have a question for Gary. What parallel do you see between American Civil War and other famous civil wars, like Civil War in Spain in 1930s, or maybe even Russian Civil War, if at all? And what impact American Civil War had on other countries? What was world opinion, if there was such thing at that time, and how different countries reacted to the event in the U.S.?
Well, first of all, what are there similarities between the American Civil War and other major civil wars, such as the Russian Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, and so forth? I think that there are some similarities between our Civil War and many other civil wars, whether they're even the English Civil War. But I don't. But there are also tremendous differences, and I think it's always dangerous to try to treat one as being just like another one, or really very much like another one, because I think the conditions are very different, the cultures are very different, and so in some ways civil wars, I mean, they pit people of one nation against one another. They're alike in that regard. They're very bloody. The big ones are the Spanish Civil War, relatively even bloodier than the American Civil War. So there's that similarity, but in other ways I think there are tremendous differences. In terms of how the world viewed the American Civil War, I think there was a division of opinion. Many Europeans were quite sympathetic to the Confederacy for various reasons. The Confederates presented themselves as simply trying to exercise their right of self-determination. Now that resonated in Ireland, for example. The Irish, many of them, were very much on board with the Confederacy in that regard. Many of the 48ers, those who had embraced the revolutionary movement in the late 1840s in Europe, would tend to side more with the United States in many ways. So it depended on what one's politics were, what country you were in, as to whether you would be more prone to take a positive view of the Confederacy or of the United States. But Europe followed the war very closely. It's the only war going on at that point in the Western world, and it's a very big war, so there's a great deal of coverage in the Times of London. Punch got wonderful cartoons out of it. If you look at how Punch covered it, they covered it with a great sense of British humor and a very harsh eye in many ways. Le Temps in Paris gave enormous coverage to the war, so it's a huge event in the Western world. It gets a lot of coverage. from Western Europe, and you would have people aligning mentally with one side or the other.
Just as an aside, how were the stories transmitted overseas? How did they get the reporters here and then the stories in London, Paris, and elsewhere?
Well, they got there slowly. It took 10 or 11 days. There's no transatlantic cable yet, so news takes 10 or 11 days to, you would have a correspondent in the United States observing, writing out the observations, and then sending them by vessel to Europe. You'd have some sketch artist, Frank Visitelli, who sketched for the Times of London, and one of the few sketch artists who worked primarily in the Confederacy. He would prepare his sketches. They would make the voyage to Britain, and they'd end up in the Times a short time thereafter. So that's how it went. It took a while for news to get back and forth.
Las Vegas, Nevada, you're next.
Hi, Steve and Dr. Gallagher. Wonderful program today, as all these in-depth programs are. My question is similar to one that was asked about half an hour ago, but I'm not sure you had the opportunity to address it, about the tactics.
He's taking careful notes.
I'm taking notes now with my orange pen.
Go ahead. It's a book TV pen.
With my book TV pen.
I see. You get the commercial in for the pens there. I've always wondered why the tactics in World War I of frontal assaults were employed, given the fact that they seemed to be so ineffective in the Civil War. I've personally always suspected that that was because of contempt on the part of the Europeans for the generalship and for American soldiers. But I've asked this question of a couple of other historians on C-SPAN, and they've usually rejected that. So I'd be very interested in your remarks, and thanks again for such a wonderful program. Bye-bye.
Well, I'm not sure which historians rejected that out of hand, but I guess I might take a different position. I think that Europe didn't put a great deal of stock in what went on in the American War. I think that many of them tended to view the American War as a war of amateurs, of these huge citizen armies, with most of the officers even being citizens rather than professionally trained soldiers. So I'm not sure that very many, at least professional soldiers, in Europe took a lot away from the American Civil War. Some British officers wrote a good deal about it. G.F.R. Henderson wrote a famous biography of Stonewall Jackson, for example, that was very widely read, a very admiring volume about Jackson. But clearly, when you get to World War II, the same thing, or excuse me, World War I, the same things are happening that happened during the Civil War. There are frontal assaults with enormous casualties, far greater casualties, because the killing power of weaponry was so much greater in World War I. So if Europeans really were paying attention to the American Civil War, they didn't learn some of the basic lessons. I think they probably would have paid more attention to the European wars that came right in the wake of the American Civil Wars, the Prussian and French and so forth wars. I think those would have resonated more with the Europeans.
A couple of books that you're associated with, the Richmond Campaign of 1862, and you call it a watershed battle in the Civil War.
Yes, I think the 7 Days campaign of late June and early July 1862 is a much more important watershed than Gettysburg, for example. Most people think Gettysburg is the great turning point of the war, that the Confederacy has a chance to win up until July 1863, and then Gettysburg in tandem with Vicksburg pretty much sealed the Confederacy's fate. I just don't think that's true. And I don't think Americans in the summer of 1864, for example, would have said it was true if we'd been able to poll them. But Richmond came at an extremely important time in the war. The United States had won enormous success out west, Ulysses S. Grant primarily, Forts Henry and Donelson, Shiloh, United States naval power had captured New Orleans, Memphis had fallen, Nashville had fallen. United States armies are triumphant in the west. And in the east, George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac, the largest army of the United States, was within 5 miles of Richmond. Now, I think had Richmond fallen in the summer of 1862, the war would have been over. And it would have been over without emancipation, because emancipation was not yet on the table. The war had to get longer, more brutal, more all-encompassing before the United States really embraced emancipation. But McClellan did not capture Richmond, and I think he didn't capture Richmond because Joseph Johnston, whom I alluded to earlier, was wounded in the Battle of Seven Pines at the end of May, and Robert E. Lee replaced him, and Lee immediately took the offensive, and Lee defeated McClellan in the 7 Days battles. And that really turned the entire tenor of the war around. The Confederate people took heart, and the war in Virginia very quickly was reoriented from Richmond all the way to the Potomac River by Lee. And so I see the 7 Days campaign in bringing Lee to the fore and putting starting the process that would make Lee the most important Confederate and his army the most important Confederate national institution. By doing that, the war was really extended for 3 years, which made it a very, very different war. I don't think there's a more important campaign in the Civil War in terms of long-term implications than the 7 Days.
Midway between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Spotsylvania County, and you write about the campaign there. What happened?
Well, Spotsylvania is the second act of that drama between R.E. Lee and U.S. Grant that we call the Overland Campaign, that includes the Battle of the Wilderness, then Spotsylvania, fighting around the North Anna, and then Cold Harbor, and eventually the armies end up at Petersburg, where a siege begins. It's the bloodiest stretch of the war. It's a stretch that sees more than 100,000 casualties between the two armies. It brings to the fore Americans had been through an enormous amount by the spring of 1864. They'd been through Gettysburg, and they'd been through Chickamauga and Shiloh and the 7 Days, these very bloody battles. But typically there'd been a battle and then a period of rest after the battle. These campaigns between Grant and Lee began a stretch where there is no rest between the battles, and Spotsylvania is the second of these very bloody battles in the Overland Campaign. And it includes, I think, the single worst stretch of fighting in the entire conflict, which was the fight for just about 250 yards of earthworks called the Bloody Angle retrospectively, where it was just the most horrific, unrelenting combat imaginable. Combat that was so intense that a 22-inch oak tree, 22-inch diameter, was felled by musket fire. So many mini balls hit it that the tree tumbled down. The stump of that tree is in the Smithsonian now, with many hundreds of the mini balls still visible in it. It's just a very bloody stop, Spotsylvania is, on this road that Grant and Lee were traveling.
East Lansing, Michigan. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Professor, perhaps you could get your book TV pen out for me here and jot down my old questions. And thank you, Professor, for your time. I'm really enjoying this program.
We're going to have to start selling those pens on our website.
That's right.
Yes. Professor, few comments. Just there's a congressman running for the U.S. Senate in Ohio. His name is Sherrod Brown. He's running against a guy named Michael DeWine. And he's currently a member of the 8th Congressional District, I believe, in the Ohio House, the U.S. House. And he introduced a resolution about a year ago to say that America, the government, should apologize for slavery, and you know, in a really official way. And he said that that was the one subject where he got a lot of hate mail and very acrimonious, and apparently. And number two, I watched that Ken Burns series, and I wish Ken Burns would have got Shelby Foote, the great historian, your colleague, who unfortunately is no longer with us. He said something that struck me, and I wish Burns would have got him to clarify. He said that the Civil War defined us for who we are, good or bad. And maybe you could elaborate on that point. And then also, you mentioned about McClellan, rank and file liked him. Wasn't he incompetent? And then lastly, there's another congressman from House of Representatives. His name is Major Owens. He said, happens to be a black guy. He said that Abraham Lincoln, given the circumstances he had to deal with, was the greatest politician ever. And I'll hang up, and thank you, C-SPAN, so much. I love you.
Thank you for the call and the 4 questions.
Well, I don't know if we can say anyone is the greatest politician. I think Lyndon Johnson was a pretty good politician, and Thomas Jefferson was a pretty good politician, and so was FDR. But I can't imagine that anyone is really better than Lincoln. I'm not sure Lincoln is the greatest, but he'd have to be in the very front rank of politicians. He was an extremely astute politician. It was absolutely at the core of his being. You can't understand Lincoln if you don't understand that he was a politician, and with everything that means. And so sometimes he might not look just the way we'd want him to look. Most of the time, I think he does. I have more respect for Lincoln the older I get. The more I read what he wrote, the more I think about what he did, the higher he stands in my estimation, and that certainly isn't the case with all historic figures. And I do think he's the most eloquent politician we've ever had. I don't even think it's close. In terms of McClellan, I don't think McClellan was incompetent. I think McClellan was very competent in many ways. He built the Army of the Potomac. He built the greatest army of the Republic. He was very good at that. He was an astute and intelligent person in many ways. I just don't think he had the qualities necessary to win the war for the United States. I don't think he had a killer instinct. I don't think he had a willingness to risk things for great reward, and I think that that was a fatal flaw in him as a commander. In terms of Shelby Foote, what was in Shelby Foote's mind, I have no idea. I can't speak for Shelby Foote, and alas, unless you know a good medium, he's going to be beyond our reach now. We're not going to be able to know what Shelby Foote meant exactly. I'm not surprised that the candidate from Ohio got a reaction to his comment about a formal apology for slavery. Slavery touches the rawest of nerves in the United States. Race and slavery, those have been our great national bugaboos since the establishment of our country. Nothing gets people more on edge than talking about slavery, talking about race. That's one reason that the Civil War is so important to our being able to understand our nation. You simply cannot understand what we are now if you don't understand the Civil War. They were grappling with the same kinds of questions in many ways that we are now, and it's just the rawest of our national nerves, and that's an indication of the degree to which it remains so, that even in a congressional race in 2006 it can provoke that kind of response.
From your book, Lee the Soldier, I want to show our audience some of the etchings of Robert E. Lee. What would he have sounded like?
I've often wondered what Robert E. Lee would have sounded like. I think one thing he would not have sounded like is sort of the generic Hollywood Southern accent. I don't think he would have sounded like he wandered in from the Dukes of Hazzard stage, for example. I think he would have had a very patrician accent, whatever that meant within a mid-19th century Southern context. One European observer said that Lee and those Southerners like him spoke just like Englishmen. A.J.L. Fremantle said that. Fremantle left a wonderful diary, but I don't know exactly what that means. They spoke just like Englishmen. I don't know what that means. Lee, maybe he would have had a kind of Tidewater accent. Maybe he would have said house. Maybe he would have said about. I don't know. I've often wondered that myself. I've wondered it about Lincoln. We know Lincoln had a kind of backwoods accent. He probably would have said skeered rather than scared, or keer. I mean, Lincoln would have sounded very different from Lee, I think.
Was it an easy or painful decision for him to join the Confederate Army?
I think it was a painful decision well, first of all, for Lee to leave the United States Army. It's a two-stage process with him. First, he has to decide to leave the United States Army. He just accepted a colonelcy, which was the highest rank he'd ever had, of course, in the United States Army, and he resigned that commission and became head of the Virginia State Forces to begin with. Then he joined the Confederate Army a few weeks later. I think it was a hard decision for him. You often read that it's the only decision he could have made. Well, 30% of the men born in Virginia who held United States Army commissions in 1860 stayed in the United States Army. So many Virginians took a different path than Lee did, not just George Thomas and Winfield Scott, who are famous, but nearly 30% of all of them. I think it was a very tough call for him. I think Lee loved the United States. He had these profound ties to the establishment of the nation through his father, who was one of Washington's lieutenants, and who had and his uncles who'd signed the Declaration of Independence and been right at the center of the establishment of the Republic. I think Lee had profound ties to the United States. He also had profound ties to Virginia, and the Virginia ones trumped the United States ones. And then soon he became an ardent Confederate. He's not just a Virginian, he becomes a Confederate, and then Virginia's interests have to be subordinate to the Confederacy. He's like everyone else. Everyone has a range of loyalties. And one of the fascinating things about looking at the Civil War is to see how these loyalties play out and how people decide which loyalties are going to trump others at different points.
When did he die?
He died in 1870, October of 1870, 63 years old.
Cambridge, Massachusetts, you're next.
Good morning. I'm one who actually abhors blissful ignorance. Situation regarding Lee, at the root of his zeal for the Confederacy was his racial animus, while proclaiming, as many did, Christianity as their virtues. A couple of very brief topics, and I'm happy to see that you still have your pen handy. Just as Lewis and Clark, the mere mentioning of Lewis and Clark, the blissful ignorance of omitting York, who without York, they would have undoubtedly been accosted. I haven't heard one thing about the contraband, and the actual, for lack of a better term, impact they had on this outcome. And a couple other points. The Southern arrogance regarding price gouging of cotton when attempting to export to Britain, that cost them. And also regarding Reconstruction, I think the reason Reconstruction isn't so romantically portrayed, if you will, is because it was one of the first times the African American agency was exhibited, and the aptitude for African American agency was exhibited.
Thank you.
Well, I think that African American agency was exhibited on a very wide scale during the Civil War. In other words, before Reconstruction, although in very different ways during Reconstruction, because African American men were able to vote in fairly large numbers for much of Reconstruction, and there was simply a different level of participation on the part of African Americans in many ways during Reconstruction. But the agency is there during the Civil War as well. You brought up contrabands. Contrabands are, for those who may not be familiar with the term in the audience, contraband was the term applied to slaves who made their way to Union lines. Ben Butler, in the spring of 1861, said that slaves who made their way to his lines were contraband of war, which meant that under international law he did not have to return them to the Confederacy. You could seize contraband of war. Anything that contributed to your opponent's ability to wage war could be labeled contraband and seized. That was the term that Butler used, and it was a term that stuck for the rest of the war. We don't have good figures on how many of the 3.5 million slaves in the Confederacy became contrabands. The estimate is usually around 500,000 or so, so 1 in 7. And they, by making their way to Union military lines, confronted the United States government with the question of, okay, here we are, what's our status? Are we free? Are you going to send us back? Are we in some kind of quasi-free state? You have to deal with us. Their presence in Union lines pushed the whole process of emancipation forward. So anyone looking at how emancipation came during the Civil War has to look not only at Lincoln and what he did, not only at Congress and the radical Republicans and black and white abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass and others. You also have to look at the actions of, on the ground, of contrabands. The other element in that, of course, is the United States Army. Even though it's often commanded by conservative soldiers who couldn't care less about slaves or black people, it's the presence of United States military power that gives slaves a place to go. And those who seize that opportunity to go to Union lines then put pressure on the Lincoln government and Congress to act on their being present behind United States lines. So it's again, I've used the word complex many times, but I'll use it again. Emancipation involves a complex equation of actions by Congress, by Lincoln, by African Americans who flee slavery toward the Union military lines, and the part of Union armies. A perfect example of how armies can act as an agent of liberation even when their commanders don't care is William Tecumseh Sherman's march through central Georgia. Sherman was perfectly at ease with slavery. He was intensely racist by our standards. Thousands of African Americans attached themselves to his army as it moved from Atlanta to Savannah, and once his army got to Savannah, he didn't want them interfering with his operations as he viewed it, and so he spoke with black leaders from this group, and they reached an agreement where many thousands of these black people would be settled along abandoned and confiscated lands in South Carolina and Georgia. And so it's It's very complicated. Contrabands play an important role. There's a great deal of black agency during the Civil War.
Grand Junction, Colorado, you are next.
Yes, good afternoon, gentlemen. Dr. Gallagher, I too am from San Luis Valley of southern Colorado and became a Civil War historian and a buff. And I was wondering if, from looking at my readings of Anders and numerous textbook writers, in your opinion, how close was Pickett and Kemper and Armistead to actually being successful in the charge? Many people have said, well, they were close. Others said it was just a kind of glorified, glamorous charge. And what was your view on how successful it was?
What's my view on how successful the Pickett-Pettigrew assault was? Did it really have a chance for success? I don't think it did. Primarily because there were no supports waiting to follow up any success that Pickett and, to his left, Pettigrew and Trimble might achieve. The Confederates achieved a momentary breakthrough of the Union lines on the afternoon of July 3rd at Gettysburg when they crossed the stone wall. Armistead crossed the wall. Kemper already shot down before he got there. But having done that, there's no one behind them. There's no strength behind them. That's the real question I have about Lee's plan on July 3rd at Gettysburg. Okay, you put 12,000 men in a position. You put 150 guns in position and have a bombardment. Then the infantry goes in. And then if the infantry is successful, what happens? How do you exploit that opening? And there I don't see an answer. And because I don't see an answer, I really see very little chance that assault, that very famous assault, had real potential for success.
One of the books credited with our guest, Gary Gallagher, is the Antietam Campaign. This is what it looks like. And last month, he joined teachers from New Mexico to share with them his insight into this battle in Maryland.
There's sort of a demented literature that's out and about now that says the war was really about Lincoln and the Republicans making big government. That's what the Civil War is really about. The Confederate government intrudes far more in its citizens' lives. This allegedly state rights republic, slaveholding republic, did far more to abridge individual liberties and freedoms than the United States government did. And one of the first big steps was instituting national conscription. Americans had been asked to serve before that in military forces by the federal government. Beginning with the Confederates in the spring of 1862, they're compelled to serve, and it's an enormous step, very controversial. A huge spike in desertions in the Confederate Army came when that Conscription Act was put into place. Lee was very astute in terms of understanding that the key to winning the war lay with the attitude of the civilian populations. He wrote it to his son Custis, his oldest son, in 1861. He hoped that by going north, he would hurt the Republicans, would hurt the Lincoln administration, that with the elections coming up in November of 1862, the off-year elections, he thought that this would give a boost to the Democrats if the biggest rebel army was moving with impunity around the Maryland or Pennsylvania countryside. And at the end of the day, as you know, there will be more casualties here than on any other day in United States history, 23,500 or so in one day. And Lee's army will have been pushed right to the wall time and time and time and time again. Is there shade? Okay, get in the shade. We'll stop in the shade. And no, Ed, really, I know you need shade. The dead gunners around it, a dead horse right there. You can see the artillery damage on the Dunker Church, on the end of the Dunker Church that we're looking at. You can also see how high the West Woods were at that time. Much higher, they're much more substantial woods than they are now, although they're growing up very nicely where they've been replanted by the National Park Service. This is a Napoleon. In Civil War parlance, it has a bronze tube, which is why it's turned green. It would have been shiny during the Civil War. On all these battlefields, the tubes are usually original. This one is 1862. It was cast. The weight is on there. This tube weighs 1,222 pounds. The carriages are reproduction carriages, and the fire wraps around the round, ignites the internal fuse as it comes out, off it goes, and then it explodes in the air. All Civil War rounds explode in the air. They're not like Hollywood where they explode on the ground and then bodies fly in every direction. They only hit the ground if the fuse doesn't work. You know, the cornfield's actually planted in corn this year. This is it to our right. That's the most famous cornfield, or most infamous cornfield during the Civil War. Takes up about 23 acres, and there were more than 8,000 casualties in that near or in that one little field. The Union commander Hooker wrote a very famous description of this cornfield afterward. He said that he walked through the cornfield and it looked like there'd been such a heavy volume of musketry and artillery fire in here. He said it looked like someone had gone along with a knife and cut every stalk off right at the ground. So we would have seen this field now. In an hour and a half, there would have been no cornfield here anymore. We disintegrated. This is where the heaviest fighting of the Battle of Antietam takes place. It's this first phase of the battle. That monument to your right front, the smaller one, is to Clara Barton. Some of you read it when you came by. This is where Clara Barton, after fighting the entrenched male bureaucracy in the United States Army, got her way to a battlefield. She was active through the whole war, as you know. I think her greatest act of the entire war came at the end when she went down to Andersonville. Some of you may know this, where more than 12,000 United States prisoners of war had died and been buried like cordwood in big trenches. She went down there at the end, arranged for individual burials and for the identification of as many as possible. If you go to Andersonville today, you'll see thousands of headstones for United States soldiers who died there, and it is Clara Barton who went down and did that hard work. The U.S. government didn't get into the war industry business during the Civil War. Didn't take over the rail, didn't take over industry. The northern industrial sector simply retooled and ended up producing everything the United States needed, together with all the civilian things that they needed. And inflation went to about 80%, which was about the same as World War I and World War II in the United States, only they did it with no government controls during the Civil War. So it's a very vital northern economy. Inflation in the Confederacy in places ran to 9,000%. It's hard for us to imagine how small the government is at this stage of our development. There aren't government agencies to take care of things. When two armies come and fight a battle in your neighborhood, the government doesn't come in and oversee the cleanup. You don't call FEMA when the Army of Northern Virginia marches away. It's catastrophic for the people who live there. You're left with piles of dead horses, which you'll drag together and burn. You're left with thousands of wounded men. You're left which take up all your barns and churches and houses. There's just, the government doesn't do that.
Let me take this right.
And we continue with Professor Gary Gallagher as we look at some of the photographs on a book that influenced your love of the Civil War. Let me ask you about this one, Alexander Gardner's photograph, a dead Southern sharpshooter behind the stonework in Devil's Den. We're at Little Round Top.
That picture, I can't even tell you the impact that had on me as a 10-year-old, which I guess is how old I was when I first saw it. The description of it was of this man was killed by a concussion. There wasn't a mark on his body, and there he was, sort of peacefully propped up against the rocks there. My attention was riveted on that image. I found out later, when a book by a photographic analyst named Bill Frasanito came out, that was a staged picture, that man had actually been killed elsewhere. The photographer had dragged his body over into that place and had arranged the musket and so forth to get a better composition. I was very disappointed when I learned that, but found out that it was fairly common for Civil War photographers to rearrange things to get the best composition.
This is a famous photograph. Ulysses S. Grant, Lieutenant General at Petersburg.
Yes, that's my favorite picture of U.S. Grant, and when I looked at that picture as a boy, that seemed to explain to me why the United States won the Civil War. Just looking at Grant's face, looking at the determination, the sort of quiet determination on that face, it took a lot of the mystery out of why Appomattox turned out the way it did. Even the body language in the picture, just sort of leaning casually against that pole.
And then another one that you selected, Brigadier General Jeb Stuart.
Yes, Jeb Stuart. This launched me on my romantic phase of understanding the Civil War, which was my first phase. Jeb Stuart seemed to capture everything that I now think is wrong about understanding the Civil War. That is, that it's a kind of romantic contest between knightly participants. But this picture of Stuart, he's a very young guy there with a plumed hat and his white gauntlets and a yellow sash and a scarlet-lined cape. He just seemed to be a figure from an entirely other world to me, unimaginable in the world of the early 1960s, and just very, very romantic.
As a Civil War historian, did the Grant presidency and the failures of his presidency surprise you based on the success he had in the Civil War?
Well, I think you see two different Grants as general and as president. I think part of it is that he's much more engaged as general than he is as president. There's, I think, a great deal more on his shoulders as general-in-chief than there was as president in the wake of the Civil War, although I hasten to say that I don't think his presidency was as bad as many of the polls of historians would have it. I think that, in a sense, Grant suffered from the lost cause attacks on his presidency just as he did the lost cause attacks on his generalship. The former Confederates who wrote in the lost cause tradition labeled Grant a butcher. It's an unfair label. Grant's armies suffered relatively lighter casualties than Lee's, for example. Lee is the bloodiest general by far in the Civil War, but Grant's the one known as a butcher. I think part of the reason that Grant's presidential administration got a bad name, especially from former Confederates, is because he pushed harder for civil rights and some of the civil rights related legislation than any of the other post-war presidents. He was the only one who went after the Ku Klux Klan, for example, and went after it quite strongly in some ways in the early 1870s. So I think that hurt Grant, which isn't to say that his presidency was exemplary in every way. He surrounded himself with some people he shouldn't have. He stuck with them longer than he should have. There was a good deal of corruption among those around him, although none of it was attached personally to Grant.
Our book TV bus traveled to Minneapolis, and another question on the role women played or may have played in the Civil War.
I heard through various sources that at the time of the Civil War, about half the population of the United States was foreign-born. I wondered if this is true or what the statistics are, and also what implications that had for the soldier on the battlefield speaking different languages.
Well, the 50% is too high. On the United States side, though, nearly 30% of the military-age white males were born abroad. It's interesting when we talk now about our immigration debates and what percentage of the current United States is foreign-born. 30% of the military-age males in the North were foreign-born. The percentage of the United States Army was about 25% foreign-born, so they were relatively underrepresented in the United States Army. But they were a major presence, and many of them didn't speak English, especially the Germans did not speak English, and there was a great deal of enmity directed against them. A lot of ethnic prejudice against the German regiments, especially in the Army of the Potomac. On the Confederate side, maybe 10% of the Confederate Army was made up of foreign-born men, which meant they were slightly overrepresented. Fewer than 10% of the military-age white males in the Confederacy were born outside the Confederacy. So there are major presence on both sides, much greater on the United States side, and there was a great deal of ethnic antipathy, especially toward the Germans.
And here's a question from Minneapolis.
Minneapolis, and my question for Gary Gallagher is, were there a lot of women fighting in the war, in the Revolutionary War, Civil War? I recall when my daughters were younger that there were some women fighting disguised as men. I was just curious if that was quite a few or if there's lots of books documenting that.
There were some women who dressed as soldiers and passed as men. during the Civil War. We don't know how many. We know that there were at least a few hundred. There may have been more than that. There almost certainly were more than that because we just don't know who some of them were. Now, were they statistically significant among the 3 million soldiers who fought on both sides in the course of the war? I would say no, they were not statistically significant. But were they there? Yes, they were. Some were there. But a relative, I mean a tiny percentage of the soldiers on either side would have been women.
For Gary Gallagher, next call, Battle Creek, Michigan. Go ahead, please.
Oh, good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank you, Steve, and Brian Lamb for C-SPAN. It's the best thing in television. And we'd love to see a lot more historical programs like this. Professor Gallagher, it's a pleasure and an honor to speak with you this afternoon. Leonidas Polk, another general who was killed in the Civil War. I wanted to throw that in there. But you mentioned your appeal or your interest in the Civil War began at a young age, and the same thing has happened with me, and it's really inexplicable. And everything you said just resonated strongly with me. And I'd like to hear your comment on. And I know you write mostly about the South, and I seem to have this affinity for the Southern, not so much the cause, but the whole panache of the generals and the soldiers that fought in the South, and you mentioned a couple of times the historical part of it, like with Jeb Stuart and Robert E. Lee and Grant and Nathan Bedford Forrest, and the names were just almost romantic, and yet, you know, I mean, I'm against slavery and always have been as much as you have, but yet there's this is appeal for the Southern. Not the cause, but what they fought for, and I'd like to see if maybe you could expound on that a little bit further. And I will hang up and listen to your answer. Thanks again for C-SPAN.
Sure, I'll be happy to. First, I'll put my pedant's hat on first. Polk was killed, but he wasn't an Army commander. The earlier question was about Army commanders killed. Polk was a Corps commander who was killed at Pine Mountain in 1864. But the attraction of the Confederacy is something that I've thought a great deal about, and I can use myself as an example. I was much drawn to the Confederacy as a young boy. I think partly because I read Confederate accounts before I read Union accounts, but there was more than that going on. I think a big part of it is that the Lost Cause writers did their work very well. The former Confederates who wrote in the wake of the war presented the best possible case for the Confederacy. And one thing they did was push slavery out of the picture. They knew that Lee was their best card to play. He's the best card. He's the winning general. He's their most attractive general. He has the most attractive subordinates around him, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, James Longstreet, and so forth. So they focused on Lee, which made sense. He was the most important Confederate during the war, but he's the most important to the Lost Cause writers. But he lets them write about the war without talking about slavery. And he lets them talk about these great victories against the odds, which was one of their major themes. The Confederacy had waged a hopeless war. They said in retrospect, they never would have said that during the war, and so there's no loss of honor in waging a hopeless war against a much more powerful enemy. So there's that sense of the underdog that comes into play there. And they also tended to present Lee as a sort of knightly figure. As opposed to Grant, who's a hard-eyed realist, a more modern man. Now, that's not accurate either. Lee was a very modern soldier within a mid-19th century context, but I think those images put the Confederacy forward in a light that many Americans over the years have found attractive. Sort of romantic, fighting against the odds, winning battles against improbable odds, and not talking about slavery.
Why Richmond and not Montgomery or Atlanta or Charleston as the capital of the South?
Well, Montgomery started as the capital of the seven-state Confederacy initially, but they moved it to Richmond, I think, in deference to Virginia's position as by far the most important of the states in the Confederacy. It's not even close. It's just a way of acknowledging how important it was that the seven-state Confederacy was able to bring Virginia into the fold after Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers after Fort Sumter. Richmond is an extremely important city. It and New Orleans, the two most important in the Confederacy. Richmond, by far the most important manufacturing center. So apart from its being the political center, it had 40% of all the industry in the Confederacy early on was in one city, was in Richmond. So it's an extremely important place in an extremely important state, and so it made sense to many at the time to move it there. It also guaranteed that that stretch of Virginia between Washington, D.C. and Richmond would be the bloodiest ground in the United States.
Lodi, California. Go ahead, please.
My question is how the lesson at Fredericksburg got lost on Lee at Gettysburg and seemed to have been lost on Grant at Cold Harbor. They just kept feeding men in. Is there an answer to that?
Why did Confederate and Union generals keep launching frontal attacks during the Civil War? That's a question that often comes up. And some of the explanations are that they just didn't understand the implications of modern weaponry. There are other explanations, but I really don't think that's the case. I think part of the answer is that frontal assaults succeeded sometimes. And sometimes there weren't from the perspective of the commanders, good options to pursue other than frontal assaults. If they could launch a flank attack, would they take that option? Yes. But you can't always launch flank attacks. You can't always get around your opponent's flank. And many times, commanders on both sides saw these frontal assaults succeed. Lee saw them succeed at Chancellorsville on May the 3rd, 1863, in very heavy fighting against entrenched Federals. It's just 2 months after that, at Gettysburg, that he pursues an aggressive tactical plan again. So it's not just that they can look at Fredericksburg and say that nothing can work. Fredericksburg is a bloody failure. Cold Harbor's a bloody failure. The third day at Gettysburg is a bloody failure. But there are other instances where frontal assaults did work, and there are many instances where flank attacks really weren't possible. These people were just as smart as we are. They wasn't a generation of dumb generals who didn't get anything. They were working within the world of options available, and sometimes it seemed to them frontal assaults were the only way to go.
And Lee was a West Point cadet graduate.
Absolutely. They're all West Pointers. All the Army commanders on both sides are West Pointers. It's a West Pointers war. This is the real coming out for West Pointers as major military figures in United States history. They were junior officers in the war against Mexico, but Winfield Scott wasn't a West Pointer. Zachary Taylor wasn't a West Pointer in Mexico. The Civil War is the first time when West Pointers are really in charge.
Two of the many books edited by our guest, Gary Gallagher, as we listen to this next call, Baltimore. Go ahead, Baltimore.
Yes. A couple things. Very thankful to C-SPAN. I mean, you're right up there with sex, drugs, and alcohol. And number two, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was hung as a Confederate spy.
Who was he?
My question to Dr. Gallagher is, in Baltimore, Maryland, is not Baltimore, Maryland the only city and state, correct me if I'm wrong, that has both Confederate and Union generals statues in this city and in this state? I appreciate the answer, and thank you very much.
No, I can't. I know that Baltimore does have statues to both, and I'm just trying to think of another city that has statues to both generals, Union and Confederate generals, and I'm coming up empty right now, although I'm not willing to say there isn't another one just because I can't think of one. But Baltimore is notable for it has a very famous statue of Lee, a joint statue of Lee and Stonewall Jackson. I'm sure that's one of the ones that you're thinking of. I don't know that there isn't any other place, but I can't think of one right now, so you may be right about that.
One question that comes up in almost all of your writings, why did the Confederates fight for so long? How do you answer that?
I think that's a very difficult question, and much of the literature argues, the scholarly literature argues, that the Confederates didn't really fight that long, that they weren't really committed to the Confederacy. They should have fought longer if they were really serious about establishing their slaveholding republic. I think that interpretation runs into some pretty stark numbers, such as 1/4 of the military-age white men dead, this enormous economic and social dislocation. The loss of slavery alone is an incredible change in the world for white Southerners to come to terms with. There's nothing comparable that could happen to us now, I don't think, because so much of Southern society was predicated on slavery, both the social dimension of slavery, control of African Americans, and the economic dimension of it. So there's just dislocation beyond that which any other white Americans have had to put up with. I think a number of factors went into the reasons that the Confederates fought as long as they did, and one is that I think they perceived an increasing threat as the war went on, and especially once emancipation was on the table in terms of what the United States was going to demand in any situation that involved reunion. They were not willing to give up their slave-based social system, and so they fought very hard not to do so, both slaveholders and non-slaveholders. It wasn't just slaveholders who had a stake in slavery in the Confederacy. All white Southerners did, because, as I said a minute ago, it was a way to control the black people who lived in those southern states. White Northerners were also very racist, just not very many black people lived in the North. Whenever you got enough black people in one place in the North to pose a threat to white people, you often had very ugly consequences, such as during the draft riots in New York City in July of 1863. They started as riots against the draft and turned into riots against black people with the ugliest imaginable incidents. So I think that's part of it. They're trying to preserve their social structure, which is at risk. I also think there's the usual element that takes place in long and costly wars where you reach a point where there's so much hatred in place that you don't want to concede defeat to someone that you consider beyond the pale, which is how many white Southerners considered United States soldiers and, by extension, Northerners as the war went on. So I think there are a number of factors at play that keep the war going for 4 years.
Los Angeles, you're next for Gary Gallagher.
Hello, Professor Gallagher. A couple of things. You did not mention the Confederate Constitution prohibiting the importation of African slaves. Also, I think one of the answers to McClellan is the Crimean War, where he was an observer. Thirdly, comment, you mentioned McPherson. I think he would have been president of the United States had he survived the war, eventually. Graduated first in his class. I believe his death affected Sherman and the ruthlessness of the March to the Sea. And lastly, you haven't talked about Forrest yet. Thank you.
Thank you, caller.
Well, McPherson was a very attractive figure. The testimony on that is almost unanimous from the United States side. He was young. He was in his mid-30s. He was an Army commander. Sherman clearly thought very well of him. Grant thought very well of him. Had he lived, he would have had a very important military career at least, and maybe a political career. We don't know. So you're right about him. He was a very promising young officer, a fair-haired boy, if you like, because he was in Grant's circle. People who were in Grant's circle did well. People who were not in Grant's circle didn't do so well. George H. Thomas is an example of a very important example of that. In terms of Nathan Bedford Forrest, I haven't mentioned him. Forrest is one of the great lost cause figures as well. Shelby Foote calls him one of the two authentic geniuses of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln and Nathan Bedford Forrest. I find that an absolutely inexplicable statement. I don't see how you can put Nathan Bedford Forrest in the same breath, in the same room, or in the same state with Abraham Lincoln. Forrest was good at what he did. He was good at leading cavalry on raids and in being a nuisance to United States commanders. Sherman, with his usual hyperbolic touch, said that if it cost 10,000 lives and bankrupted the Treasury, he wanted Nathan Bedford Forrest killed. Well, he didn't mean that, of course. Sherman's always good for a quotation. He had no filter between his brain and his mouth or his pen, so he's good to quote, but it doesn't mean he means everything. I think Forrest's importance and skills are vastly exaggerated. I think he'd reached his natural level of competency. I don't think he could have commanded an army. I don't think he could have commanded a corps. I don't think he was balanced as a person. I think he was very volatile. I don't know what the diagnosis would be now if somebody could really put Forrest on the couch, but whoever delivered the news to him would probably be at peril. Forrest was a difficult fellow.
A couple of emails. Bill Anderson of Spotsylvania, Virginia says, why did the remaining states in the U.S. just say good riddance to the seceding states and let them secede?
Yeah, why not just let them go? That's a question that you often get. Okay, these states aren't happy in the United States anymore. Fine. South Carolina's always been a pain anyway. They're always complaining about something. Just let them go and we'll go on the way we are. I think it's hard to recapture what union meant to untold millions of people at the time. These are people reared on the rhetoric of Daniel Webster, reared on the example of the founding generation. They believed that the Union meant something. It's a clear case of American exceptionalism. This is something that has never existed anywhere else in the world, Americans would have said. We're a democratic republic. If we fail, then maybe the democratic example will be snuffed out in the world. Maybe this will never happen again. Lincoln's writings are filled with that kind of rhetoric, as are the writings of many common soldiers and many civilians behind the lines in the United States. They had a sense of union as something to be cherished, something to be guarded, even if it meant risking your life to do that. And if you allow these states to go, that might just be the first step. Maybe then the western states would go. What we would call the Midwest now. Maybe the whole enterprise would collapse, and that would be a great tragedy, according to many people who lived in the North. And hundreds of thousands who lived in the Confederacy. There were many white Southerners who were never on board with the Confederacy, Unionists who lamented the fact that their states had seceded.
Very quickly, how many people lived in the North at the time? How many in the South?
There were about 22 million people living in the North, 3.5 million slaves, and about 5.5 million white people living in the South, and a couple of 100,000 free African Americans in the South.
And how many states did we have in 1861, 62, before the South seceded?
Well, you have 33 states, and Kansas comes in as a state in 1861, and Nevada comes in as a state, although it shouldn't have. It didn't really have enough people, but it brought in 2 Republican senators. Nebraska comes in as a state in 1864, proving that some things never change. So you get Kansas as a new state, you get Nevada as a new state, and you get West Virginia as a new state. It's the western counties of Virginia, the trans-Allegheny counties, are broken away from Virginia, and West Virginia becomes a state in 1863.
Next call is from Boca Raton, Florida.
Yes. Hello.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Thank you to C-SPAN. This is just wonderful. Dr. Gallagher, I had the pleasure of meeting you a few years ago at Florida Atlantic University, Dr. Stephen Engel. I'm a graduate student right now finishing a thesis on California and the Civil War, which usually nobody knows too much about. Do you have any comment on California's role, the California 100, the battalion, and also a very interesting quote from Hubert Howe Bancroft in his History of California. He said that the truth will have to be acknowledged that the admission of California as a free state led to the War of the Rebellion. I'm just wondering what you think about that. And I have one other question. When I was in college, I read The History of the Southern Confederacy by Clement Eaton, and I never see him as a source. Dr. Engel has said he's out of favor. Can you comment on that?
Well, the History of the Southern Confederacy is 40 years old now, and I think it was one of the standard histories of the Confederacy when I was growing up, but there are much better histories of the Confederacy now, I think. And it's time for someone else to write a new synthesis of the Confederacy. Emory Thomas's, I think, is still the best one. It was published in 1979, but there's been a great deal of work since Clement Eaton wrote. So I wouldn't put Eaton near the top of things I would read about the Confederacy. Hubert Howe Bancroft's comment about the admission of California as a free state, bringing the Civil War, it did disrupt the balance of senators in the United States Senate, gave free state senators the advantage which they never relinquished after that. So it's in the mix. I don't think that alone would have brought the Civil War. It's a very delayed reaction if the admission of California in 1850 brings Civil War in 1861, but it's a factor that plays into the overall mix. I'm glad you're writing about California. I think it's time we have a book on California during the Civil War. I suspect Los Angeles had people been able to vote would have joined the Confederacy, you might have had two Californias during the Civil War, although you know more about this than I do. Seems that sentiment in California, as in so many places, was divided, pro-Northern, pro-Southern. California's contribution to the war, in terms of men, you mentioned the California 100. There are a handful of men from California serve in the Civil War, but it's statistically insignificant.
Well, by coincidence, our next call is from California. Alameda, go ahead, please.
Thank you. How you doing, Gary? Dr. Gallagher. Reginald.
Gary is fine.
Gary, hey, Gary. You can call me Reggie then.
All right.
So my question is, as a young person, a lot of times we only hear about, when we hear history, we just hear, facts and, regurgitated things we're supposed to memorize, but we don't really learn the lesson. As far as the Civil War, what kind of lessons can we learn about just dealing with people or just the history of this nation?
Thank you.
That's a great question, and I think what the Civil War shows us is how our system can engage enormously complicated and divisive issues, often with great success, sometimes with much less success, but how the system manages to address these questions without having the whole enterprise fail. You cannot get bigger questions than you have at stake during the Civil War. What are you going to do with slavery, with this, as I said earlier, this festering cancer in the body politic? It's been a problem since the 1790s. It remains a problem throughout, and finally it comes to a head, and Americans cope with it in a very messy and bloody fashion, and in the end get rid of it, as they should have long before. But they also engage the question of the relationship between the central government and the state and local governments, and they engage to a degree the question of what citizenship means in the United States, without nearly as clear a resolution as you have with slavery, or whether the Union can be divided via secession or not. But I think that's certainly one of the great lessons to learn from looking at the Civil War, and that lesson is that our system has, through the years, taken on the most fundamental questions, the most important, the most divisive, the potentially most catastrophic questions, and tried to deal with them. This is the worst example of it in our history, in that we slaughtered each other in the course of dealing with them, but we did it and still managed to emerge intact. The questions don't get bigger, the outcomes don't get bigger, and when you throw into this mixture this fascinating array of individuals, military, non-military, North and South, black and white, male and female, you just have a story that is, from my point of view, irresistible and constantly growing more complex. To go back to the question long ago about the graduate student who wondered whether there's anything new to say about the Civil War. Yes, there is. There's always going to be something new to say about it. And it's
with regard to the outcome, Art Chechen of Pacifica, California says Newt Gingrich, William Forrest Chin have written fictional books suggesting alternative conclusions to Gettysburg and the aftermath. Your opinion?
Well, yeah, I think those are interesting exercises. They're fun, because I think only if you believe the war was fated to turn out the way it did are those kinds of things completely pointless. It could have turned out differently. It's interesting to speculate about some of the ways that it might have turned out. Now, in the end, where do those get us? I'm not sure where they get us, except giving us an opportunity to imagine different scenarios and to bring to bear on that imagining factors that are fun and interesting to explore. I can't emphasize too strongly that people should not begin at the end of the story and work backward. If they really want to understand how the Civil War unfolded, if they want to understand how people perceived it, what might have happened, they should read forward in the evidence and not backward from Appomattox.
We have on our website at booktv.org a link to Professor Gary Gallagher's website, and if they go to your site, part of UVA, what will they see?
They'll see a mugshot and some book titles, and I can't remember what else is on there. I think there's a few words about what I'm working on now. I think that may be on there as well.
Which is what?
I'm finishing a book on the Civil War as it's handled in recent films and art. And by art, I mean the art produced for people, for the popular Civil War market, the kind of art advertised in popular Civil War magazines. Films since Glory, from Glory down through Gods and Generals and Cold Mountain, and art produced in the last 25 or 30 years. I'm interested in what's painted, what isn't, how Hollywood handles emancipation, the Confederacy, and so forth. I'm not an art critic, I'm not a film critic, but I'm interested in what themes they address and which ones they don't.
Grandville, Ohio. Go ahead, please.
Dr. Gallagher, somebody's already stole a little bit of my thunder on Gettysburg and Newt Gingrich, but I was wondering what you thought of that possibility and what would happen if the Confederacy had won there. And I tie that in with Vicksburg. I often think that Vicksburg has been way overlooked in the popular history of the Civil War, and I wonder if you could sort of tie that in with the significance with Gettysburg. In fact, I think you'll need your little red pencil now, because I have a couple other questions here.
Well, it's an orange pen, and I'm going to try to find one of the photographs from Vicksburg, and stay on the line. We'll come back with your follow-up.
Okay.
Oh, well, in terms of what would have happened had the Confederates won at Gettysburg, I think it would have complicated Abraham Lincoln's life. I don't think it would have meant that Washington would fall. I think Lee had no plan to try to attack Washington or Baltimore or any other big United States city. I don't think he had the means to capture any of them. It would have made things more difficult for Lincoln. I have no doubt about that. But I also have no doubt that it would not have ended the war. That would have not been the end of the war had the Army of the Potomac retreated from Gettysburg to the Pipe Creek line down near the Monocacy River or wherever. I just think there would have been another battle somewhere, sometime, and then events would have played out differently. I completely agree with you that within the context of the Civil War, Vicksburg is more important. Gettysburg is less important.
What happened at Vicksburg?
Vicksburg was one of two remaining strongholds the Confederates had on the Mississippi River. Port Hudson, Louisiana was one. Vicksburg, Mississippi was the second. And after U.S. Grant, in his most brilliant campaign and one of the great campaigns in all of American military history, captured Vicksburg, first through maneuver and then through a siege. It capitulated on July the 4th, the same day that Lee retreated from Gettysburg, 1863. Control of the river, Port Hudson fell shortly thereafter. Control of the river, the Mississippi, then passed unequivocally to the United States, and Lincoln was pleased with that. Many people were pleased with it. I frankly don't think it was that big a deal because in meaningful terms the Confederacy had not been able to use the Mississippi River since Memphis and New Orleans had fallen, and they had fallen more than a year earlier than that. But still, the Confederacy lost an entire army at Vicksburg, surrendered to Grant, and they lost this bastion on the Mississippi. It's an unequivocal defeat, and the Confederate people were very dispirited by that. Gettysburg was much murkier, especially the way it was reported in the Confederacy, because the first day was a great Confederate success at Gettysburg, and that got a lot of coverage in the South. I think the fact that Lincoln was very disappointed in Gettysburg. He wrote a letter to George Gordon Meade, the Union commander at Gettysburg, shortly after the battle. He never sent it to him. Lincoln, this is a good example of, we often write things, we'll write an email in response to something that upsets us, and then the question is, do you push the send button or not? Lincoln didn't push the send button on this note to Meade, but he said that although he was happy with the victory at Gettysburg, Meade's failure to follow up meant the war would drag on indefinitely. And I think that was a perception that many in the North took on over time. Lincoln certainly didn't see Gettysburg as the great watershed of the war.
Caller, you still with us?
I sure am. We mentioned Vicksburg and the water there. We talk a lot about generals there, but what about the Navy, particularly both the Northern and Confederate navies? How important was their parts in the war?
Well, I run into Navy fans frequently, and no matter how you try to squint and look at things, the Navy just isn't as important as the Army in the Civil War. The United States Navy is overwhelmingly more powerful than the Confederate Navy. The U.S. Navy goes from a force of fewer than 50 vessels in commission in 1860 to more than 700 at the end of the war. It rivals the Royal Navy as one of the two great navies of the world at the end of the war, with several dozen ironclads. The Confederacy simply can't match up. The U.S. Navy plays a very important cooperative role on the Mississippi River, on the Tennessee River, on the Cumberland River, and along the coastlines, blockading and so forth. But the Confederates simply aren't in a position in terms of their Navy to mount any kind of challenge. They build some ironclads, They send some raiders out to prey on United States merchant vessels, the most famous being the Alabama. But they don't really have an impact on the war. They have an impact on the United States merchant marine, which is set back about 50 years or so by the war, but not on the war itself.
Next call, San Diego. Go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Gallagher, I have a comment and a question. I believe our country is involved in a kind of civil war right now. Americans are not physically fighting one another, but we are strongly divided, especially on religious and political ideologies. And my question is, in the 1800s, Southern slaveholders used passages from the Bible to justify slavery, saying that God approved of the master-slave relationship. What part did religion play in the Civil War?
Well, religion, I think, is a much understudied element of the Civil War. I think it was much more important to many mid-19th century Americans than the literature on the war would suggest. I'm not saying all Americans were deeply religious. They certainly were not. But I think that historians as a group have not accorded as much attention to religion as they should have. There's a book that will be coming out fairly shortly by a major scholar named George Rabel that I can't wait to read. George is an excellent historian, and he's writing a book on religion during the Civil War. I think religion is present on both sides. Both sides invoke God's name. Both sides will express that they think God's on their side, then they think God's not on their side. You get an ebb and flow of optimism and pessimism in that regard. You're absolutely right. That white Southerners mined the Bible very effectively before the Civil War to find justifications for slavery. The Old Testament stood them in very good stead in that regard. People in the North, on the other hand, the abolitionists, some of the abolitionists and others would say that slavery was not compatible with the parts of the Bible that they chose to emphasize. So you could pick and, just as you can pick and choose in the Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence to find the passages that suit your arguments, depending on whether you're a Union or a Confederate sympathizer, so also can you do that with the Bible, depending on which side of the slavery divide you were on. But I like your question because it underscores the fact that we need to know a lot more than we do know about religion as a factor in the Civil War.
One of the sketchings from the National Geographic book that you brought along from 1961 showing just the conditions for the soldiers, both Confederate and Union soldiers, as they moved through the rain, the diphtheria, the other ailments that plagued the soldiers. Any idea how many died just from the conditions?
Well, yeah, the 2 men died from disease for every one who died from a wound in battle. So that's the proportion. 2/3 of those 620-some thousand deaths at a minimum are from disease, not from being shot. Biggest killers, dysentery, chronic diarrhea, enormous killers, enormous killers. Measles killed untold thousands of men during the Civil War. So disease is a horrible factor in terms of wreaking havoc on the armies on both sides. It was especially gruesome for units as they just came into the field. Especially many rural boys would be exposed to diseases they hadn't been exposed to. The city guys, in some ways, were a little tougher in that regard, and the diseases took an enormous toll. You had this awful equation also of deadlier weapons in the soldiers' hands during the Civil War, but the great medical discoveries of the 19th century not quite in place yet. Surgeons didn't even know to wipe their instruments off in between operations. If you were shot between your neck and your waist, there was basically a triage said just put you off to the side. There's basically nothing they can do. You either live or you don't. If you're shot in an arm or a leg, they can amputate and save you that way, or at least give you a better shot. But it's very bad in terms of medical care.
San Diego for Dr. Gary Gallagher. Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to make the case that the final pivotal battle of the war was, as you mentioned, not Vicksburg. I would like to make the case it was Gettysburg, and that the critical point at Gettysburg, I think most people would agree, was Little Round Top, and that the greatest fighting battlefield officer that we probably produced in the war was Joshua Chamberlain. And if you tie that all together, you have a man who's fighting for the highest principles, the end of slavery and the preservation of the Union. That's Joshua Chamberlain. He rallies his troops and saves the Army of the Potomac. And if you think of that as saving the United States, because we would have been then in a war of attrition, Lincoln may not have even been reelected if we had lost at Gettysburg. Remember, it's not just the victory at Gettysburg that wasn't so great, but it was a defeat at Gettysburg that would have possibly destroyed the Union. And if the Union was destroyed, and there was a long protracted war that ended up in two countries, what would the world's history be like?
Well, the world's history would be different, needless to say, had the Confederacy triumphed. But I'm just going to have to disagree respectfully with making the afternoon of, or early evening of July 2nd on the slopes of Little Round Top the great tipping point of the American Civil War. I think that by far the darkest period of the war for the United States came in June and July and August of 1864. Long after Gettysburg. Gettysburg was more than a year in the rearview mirror by that point. Lincoln, as you probably know, wrote his famous blind memorandum at the beginning of the 4th week of August, saying he was pretty sure the Republicans were not going to be reelected and that they were going to have to win the war between that point and when the Democrats took office. I think that's the nadir of Northern civilian morale, and that's the key to who wins the war. It's which civilian population gives up first. And I think it was only Sherman's success at Atlanta and Philip Sheridan's success in the Shenandoah Valley that turned things around for the Lincoln administration and for the Republicans and brought those great Republican majorities in the Congress and sent Lincoln to the White House a second time in November of 1864.
The Gettysburg Address, your impression?
I think the Gettysburg Address is the second greatest political speech in American history, right behind Lincoln's second inaugural address. And what it does is, in an official way, put emancipation on the table alongside Union as one of the great war, a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln puts it. It's a war for Union. It's also a war for a new birth of freedom, and that's what those men who had given their lives at Gettysburg had made possible, and that's what Lincoln wanted the rest of the nation to follow through on that promise of what those men at Gettysburg had done.
Shreveport, Louisiana. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. If I might indulge me, maybe make a little mincemeat of Mr. Gallagher's arguments here. First of all, I'd like to say that I believe y'all hammering Southern whites quite a bit, but a lot of the Southerners that fought because I believe they thought genocide was going to be committed against them, and really I think Reconstruction vindicated them. But also, the Confederate Army was a little bit more cosmopolitan than what y'all trying to put on here. I know in our Texas units we had many of Mexican Americans. You had the 5 civilized Indian tribes that were also with the Confederacy. You had the first black regiment in the Civil War was the Louisiana Native Guards in the Confederacy. Also, a few days after First Manassas, the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate passed a resolution overwhelmingly stating that they weren't fighting to end slavery. It's the Critterton resolution. How can you say Grant was a great general when he had hundreds of thousands of men to hammer against the Army in Northern Virginia, who was only a shell of itself when he came on as commander? And also, I think America's greatest pure warrior was Lieutenant General Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Lincoln couldn't shine his shoes.
Thank you for the call.
Okay.
Well, I suspect Lincoln wouldn't have wanted to shine Nathan Bedford Forrest's shoes, and we'll just leave Forrest off to the side. There's one opinion of him. I have my opinion of him. It's true that in 1861, slavery and emancipation were not at the center of what the United States was fighting for. The factor that has come up in several of our questions is that the war went far beyond what anyone thought it would be in 1861. The nature of the war changed. It became a war for Union and a war that was going to kill slavery, even though I think for most white Northerners, first to last, it was a war for Union. That's what they would have said was most important about it. The comment about white genocide against the South, I don't understand that. Within a Reconstruction context, I don't know of any federal policies that targeted white Southerners for death. It's true that there were Hispanic soldiers in the Civil War, probably about 10,000. That's the best estimate. Probably more on the Confederate side than on the Union side. There were some Native American units on both sides. Stand Watie was a Confederate general, a Native American Confederate general. But almost all of those soldiers operated on the Trans-Mississippi periphery of what was going on. They really didn't play a major role at all. The comment about black soldiers in the Confederate Army is something that comes up very frequently. There's this literature now that argues that there were tens of thousands, perhaps as many as 100,000 black soldiers in the Confederate Army, and it just simply isn't true. It just isn't true. The Confederacy debated whether to put slaves in the Army very late in the war, late 1864, early 1865. Congress in the end, in March, said yes, put slaves into the Confederate Army. And a handful were drilling in Richmond right at the very end of the war. That's one of the great ironies of the war, but it was a hot debate. As Howell Cobb of Georgia said, if you put slaves in the Army, then our whole theory of government is wrong. And that gets at the heart of it. It wasn't any kind of effort to accord status to African Americans. It was a very pragmatic calculation that if the North won, all slaves were going to be freed. If the Confederacy could use a few in their armies, then they could keep most black people as slaves and only have to contemplate freedom for a handful.
San Jose, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. To Professor Gallagher, question about military training. You mentioned that the, quote, junior officers of the Mexican War were the leading generals in the Civil War. I'm interested in what kind of training they received at West Point, and then how did the experiences of the war potentially shift the training after the Civil War in the military colleges?
That's a great question. The officers who fought in Mexico, and even many of those who went to West Point in the 1840s and 1850s, received relatively little military training. West Point was preeminently an engineering school. It was the greatest engineering school in the United States down to the Civil War. Most of the great public works projects of that part of our history had some involvement from West Point trained engineers. Many of the cadets who loved military history complained about the fact Stephen Dodson Ramseur, whom I mentioned earlier, I wrote my dissertation about him, he was very disappointed that they didn't get more about the great captains and great campaigns of history at West Point. It was math, it was physics, it was how to become an engineer. So there wasn't a great deal of military training beyond some rudimentary, very low-level drill. The soldiers learned a lot in Mexico under Zachary Taylor and especially under Winfield Scott. Now, the post-war Army tried to do a great deal more with training officers in terms of military topics. That is one outcome of the Civil War, and they even used Civil War battlefields as outdoor classrooms. Those first battlefields that were saved, Gettysburg and Chickamauga and Vicksburg and Shiloh, they were administered by the War Department, and they were used to teach tactical and other lessons to United States Army officers who would ride across them on what were called staff rides.
April 15th, 1865, Robert E. Lee, Appomattox, signs the treaty that ends the war. And he said, "The war being an end, I believe it is the duty of everyone to unite in the restoration of the country and the establishment of peace and harmony."
That was Lee's attitude. Yes, Lee behaved impeccably in a public sense for the rest of his life, which was only 5 years. He said, in essence, we tried, we failed, the United States dictates terms, and we should abide by them and look to the future, not to the past. Privately, he was very unhappy with the outcome of the war. He was very unhappy with elements of Reconstruction, but publicly he didn't voice that unhappiness. He did it only within a limited circle, in a private sense, and publicly he said, accept the verdict of the battlefield and move forward.
These are my words, but he still seems to be revered in many circles.
He's one of he and Abraham Lincoln, I think, are still the two great popular figures of the Civil War, and I think that's ironic, that the man who came closest to dismembering the Union is alongside Lincoln as one of the two great popular heroes of the war.
Why? Why Lee?
I think part of that is the Lost Cause writers. We're already out of time. It's been a fast 3 hours. I think that their work was done very well. I think part of it is the underdog. I think in some ways Lee is an attractive figure to a range of people, and Grant has had a job done on him. I watched something on television the other night that described Grant as a drunken butcher. Well, that's still poor Grant. He's still trying to overcome that, and it's so far from the truth. But there it is. Hardly anyone knows that Grant even has a statue here in Washington, when in fact he has the statue in the best spot in the whole city, right in front of the Capitol, looking right at the Lincoln Memorial. And most people don't even know he's there. It's really an interesting case in how reputations can rise and fall post facto.
Couple more minutes. Stone Mountain, Georgia, you're next.
Yes, I have very little use for either Lincoln or Jefferson Davis because of the terrible slaughter that happened on both sides because of the because of the Civil War. Could you please tell me why, since slavery, however obnoxious it might have been, was legal, why could not these politicians have gotten together and paid the slave owners for their lawful investments and let them go free, let them then hire out to whoever that would hire them and pay them, rather than go through this horrendous, and I've never heard any historian address this problem.
Well, first of all, no one knew how horrendous the war was going to be. No one could have, in their wildest imaginings, foreseen a war that would be as bloody or as long as the Civil War was. The other part of that is I don't think most slaveholders would have wanted to sell their slaves, and I don't think most white Northerners would have insisted that white Southerners who did own slaves sell them. I mean, it was a world that changed very rapidly in that regard because of the Civil War. I think slavery was on a pretty steady course in 1860 had it not been for secession and then the war. And it was a question of whether it could expand or not that really triggered much of what happened. Not whether it should exist or not, but whether it should expand into the federal territories or not.
In our final minute, what fascinates you the most about the Civil War?
Well, different things at different times fascinate me about the Civil War, but it usually comes back to how people deal with these huge questions. And recently I'm also interested in how subsequent generations of Americans have dealt with the memory of how the Civil War generation dealt with those great questions. It's been an unending source of interest. It's more than interest. It is a fascination to me. I've been at it for 40 years now, more than 40 years, I hate to say, and I see no end in sight. I just think it's endlessly engaging.
And your next book will come out when?
I hope it will come out in the fall of 2007.
Gary Gallagher, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
You can get more information on Professor Gary Gallagher by logging onto our website at booktv.org and also read some of the favorite book, his second term.
Well, as a country, we were about to get back together again, or at least go into the first phase of getting back together again. There had been that enormous loss of life, but by the time that Lincoln was inaugurated for the second time, the war was just about over. Only a handful of diehards on the Confederate side would have thought victory still possible at that point. And in fact, Lee's army would surrender just about a month later, 5 weeks later or so. So it's almost the end of the war, and the process of reconstruction was just around the corner. No one knew what that would look like yet, but it was very near at hand.
I'm going to come back to what led to the war, but you quote Leon Litwack. Who is he?
Leon Litwack is one of the major historians of mid-19th century United States history. He's written about African Americans, he's written about Reconstruction, he's written about, in a broad sense, the history of the United States in the mid-19th century.
And you write about the social convulsions that we were going through in the country. We talk about the battles, but you write a lot about what America was going through, the fabric of the nation. I want to quote you, quote Leon Litwack. None of the great battles, not even Antietam or Shiloh or Gettysburg, compare to the sheer drama with the way in which the Civil War came to be transformed into a social revolution of such far-reaching proportions and consequences. Can you explain?
Yes, I quoted Leon Litwack there in the course of making a distinction between how most academic historians come at the Civil War and how most non-academic historians writing more purely for a popular audience, come at it. For most academic historians, military history is of very little interest. For most non-academic historians, only military history is interesting. I think there's a great divide in the literature on the Civil War, and a divide that I think often gets in the way of full understanding, because I don't think it's possible really to have a sense of the Civil War without having a good sense of how the home front and the battlefield intersected and influenced one another.
You also, in this lecture, said it's long past time that we bring the two civil wars together.
Yes, I think it is. I think it's time that we try to approach the war in a more expansive way, in a way that brings generals and campaigns and battles into the picture, but also brings into the picture politics and social developments, what's going on behind the lines, and more particularly brings into focus how those two, as I said earlier, influence one another. The reciprocal influences of the home front and battlefield, I think, are essential to any real understanding of the Civil War. And I think that's often lost in the literature, lost on the popular side that focuses, I think, too much just on the movements of armies, and whether tactical or strategic, and can be lost in the scholarly literature that often reads as if there were no armies campaigning at all. Either one of those approaches leaves you missing a great deal.
Is that why you said this just about a year ago, that I suspect that many in the non-academic world would be surprised to learn that students can emerge from programs in American history at many good universities without any knowledge of the military side of the Civil War?
I think that's true, and I think it would surprise a lot of people that you can talk about the Civil War without talking about military affairs. But I think that happens at many universities. Just as I think in many books written for a popular audience, you get a sense that the Civil War is only military events. Neither approach is a good way to go, I think.
Was it inevitable that the North would win?
No, it was not inevitable that the North would win. Most people, I think, or at least many people, believe that United States victory was preordained, but it was not. I think that arises from a tendency to begin at the end of the story, to begin at Appomattox with knowledge of United States victory and read back into the war with that understanding. Of course the United States won, now let's go back and see why that happened. It was going to happen, let's just see what the key milepost.
And how often?
South Carolina had cried wolf often. It had cried wolf in the 1830s, it had cried wolf again in the early 1850s, and now it was doing so again. South Carolina is in a universe of one, and I don't want to alienate people in South Carolina, but you can't say as South Carolina goes, so goes anyone else, because South Carolina was really different. It was too large to be an insane asylum and too small to be a republic, as one observer noted at the time. I think that's a very apt observation. South Carolina was certainly in the forefront of saying that if this Republican, who is running on a platform that says slavery cannot be extended into any of the federal territories, if this Republican is elected, then we're going to take drastic action.
Why did Lincoln win?
Lincoln won because he carried the key parts of the North, and he won the Electoral College. He won less than 40% of the popular vote, less than 40% of the popular vote. He wasn't even on the ballot in a number of slaveholding states, but he carried the large populous, most of the large populous northern states, and won an easy victory in the Electoral College. Even if all the electoral votes of the other three candidates had been put together, Lincoln still would have been elected in 1860.
What kind of a campaign was that for those who follow politics? What was it like?
Well, it was unlike what we're used to now. The candidates then didn't go out and campaign the way they do now. Abraham Lincoln did not go out and give speeches. He said, my views are on the record. Look at the record and you'll see what my views are. The only one of the candidates who really went out on the stump was Stephen Douglas, and he did so even in the South. At great risk to himself, great personal risk, in fact. It was quite an amazing campaign on Douglas's part. In the end, it yielded very little. He didn't carry the southern states, the slaveholding states, but he's the only one who conducted anything like what we would call a modern campaign.
Did Senator Douglas and President Lincoln get along in the years that they served together?
Well, they didn't really serve together. They ran against one another in a very famous senatorial election in Illinois in 1858. They knew each other, as lawyers and as politicians in Illinois, and I think they got along well enough. I don't think they were pals, but they got along well enough. Douglas had defeated Lincoln in 1858 in that famous senatorial election.
But when he lost to Lincoln in 1860, what was that like for him?
I think it was very hard on Douglas, but Douglas stepped forward and offered to do whatever he could to help Lincoln. I think he behaved impeccably in the wake of that election. He died very soon after the election, Douglas did. He wasn't old, but he died very soon after the election. But before he died, he did make every gesture that you would expect a gracious loser to make toward the winner.
Who do you think was the greatest military strategist in the Civil War, North and South?
The greatest military strategist, North or South, I suppose I would say Ulysses S. Grant, because he operated at a very high level. He ran the whole war for the United States. I think Winfield Scott would be right next to him. Winfield Scott was a great soldier, not much appreciated nowadays, but Scott actually in April 1861 looked down the road and essentially sketched out the strategy that would win the war for the United States.
And Winfield Scott met with this man, Robert E. Lee, before Lee became the Confederate general.
He did. He did. Scott, as he said, considered Lee to be the best soldier in the United States Army in 1860-61. They're both Virginians. Lee had been on Scott's staff in Mexico when Scott carried out a brilliant campaign from Veracruz to Mexico City. Scott had a very high opinion of Lee and hoped that Lee would take command of the United States Army outside Washington, D.C. right at the outset of the war. That's what he hoped. They made an overture to Lee, and Lee turned him down.
Our phone lines are open, 202.
Posts along the road were, I think the Confederacy had a very good chance of establishing its independence. I think a better chance than the colonies had of establishing their independence in the war against Great Britain.
From this book, The Myth of the Lost Cause and the Civil War History, you say Lost Cause is an American legend. The war was a mawkish and essentially heroic and romantic melodrama, an honorable sectional duel, a time of martial glory on both sides, and triumphant nationalism.
All of those are elements of how of how many Americans understand the Civil War. Yes, I think that's true. It seems to be a sort of romantic contest, I think, to many Americans, somehow different from modern wars, not as dirty as modern wars, not as brutal as modern wars, and I think that's a terrible misreading of what was going on. It was by far our most all-encompassing, by far our most bloody, and by far in many ways our most divisive conflict, and any effort to try to clean it up and turn it into a romantic contest between Americans who were sadly upset with one another but not really different from one another, I think is a mistake.
I'm paraphrasing in one of your books, but you essentially said that the northern approach to battle was different from the southern approach, in part because in the South they were looking for what I think you referred to as great heroic battles.
Well, I'm not sure I did say that exactly. I think
the Southern view was that
I think many of the Southern, many of the Confederate citizens, and I make a distinction between Confederates and Southerners. They're not synonyms in a Civil War context. Southerners would embrace both white and black Southerners. Confederates are white Southerners on board with the Confederacy, so they're a subset of white Southerners who are in turn a subset of Southerners. I think many Confederates, especially in the first 2 years of the war, wanted their armies to smite the enemy, wanted aggressive victories against United States armies that were moving into the Confederacy. I think they were put off by Confederate generals who tended to act on the defensive, generals such as Joseph E. Johnston. I think one reason that Robert E. Lee became such a towering figure in the Confederacy is because he gave the Confederate people the kind of generalship they wanted, which was aggressive, successful generalship that yielded these flashy battlefield victories.
The cost to the South, you quote James McPherson, the South was not only invaded but utterly destroyed. We talked about the 250,000 Confederate soldiers who lost their lives, many others who were injured. 60% of Southern wealth was decreased, most of it, as you point out, from agriculture. Half of the farm machinery ruined, and 25% of the male population between the ages of 20 to 40 were killed.
Yes, a quarter of all the white military-age males in the Confederacy were killed. It's an enormous human toll. If our losses in World War II, for example, had been comparable as a percentage to the Confederates, we would have had about 6.6 million dead in World War II instead of 400,000. So it's on a completely different scale, and a scale much heavier than losses among United States soldiers as well. The greatest loss in property, of course, came with emancipation. There were $3 billion worth of property in slaves was gone at the end of the war. Slaveholders controlled more wealth than anyone else in the United States in 1860. Property in slaves was worth more than the value of all manufacturers and all railroads in the United States put together. So it's an enormous human and physical loss that the white South confronted at the end of the Civil War.
When you tour these battlefields, Antietam or Bull Run, Manassas, Sharpsburg, what do you see?
Well, I see it's an odd sensation in some ways. What you see on the one hand is a lovely landscape now in many instances. That's certainly true at Antietam, and it's incumbent upon someone giving a tour at one of these places to remind the people on the tour that this is a landscape that would have been hideous to look at within a Civil War context. But what I really see when I'm in those places is an opportunity to convey all kinds of information about the Civil War, not just what the armies did on those sites, but also to move to broader questions about why men went into uniform on each side, what the political context was at that point in the war, why these battles mattered in a broader sense. Why was Antietam important beyond the fact that it's the bloodiest day in United States history? It's not enough to go to Antietam and know what happened in Bloody Lane, or know that the 15th Massachusetts Infantry suffered horrific casualties in the West Woods. It's important to know how Antietam figured in Lincoln's calculation regarding emancipation, how it figured in foreign relations between the United States and Great Britain and France and so forth. There's always a broader context for battles, and that's something that I think is vital to get across to anyone who visits those sites.
Let's talk for a moment about what led to the war, and you say in part the roots begin as early as 1830. What happened?
Well, they begin even sooner than that. I mean, slavery is secession without slavery is unimaginable to me. You often read that it's economics, it's different social systems, it's different this, it's different that. If you take slavery out of the picture, I cannot imagine any scenario within which a group of states would secede. So it's just as it is slavery. Absent slavery, there's not secession. I think that the wrangling about slavery heated up in the 1830s. The Missouri Compromise in 1820 was a signal. It's one of the mileposts, but it did heat up in the 1830s with the beginning of the publication of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, with Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, and it gained steam in many ways through the 1840s with the lands gained from the Mexican War and so forth. So it's a cancer, I think, slavery that's eating at the vitals of the American Republic, that's in place from the time of the founding of the Republic under the Constitution, but I think it becomes a more virulent cancer as you move from the 30s to the 40s and then especially into the 1850s.
And in the 1850s, an author by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe comes out with Uncle Tom's Cabin. You write that President Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe and said, "You're the woman that started the Civil War." But so talk about the book and then talk about the exchange between Abraham Lincoln and Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Well, Uncle Tom's Cabin was an amazing phenomenon. It was published in 1852 and it reached a huge readership. It would be an absolute runaway bestseller now if you multiply the numbers. It sold several 100,000 copies over just the first few months, and that's at a time when there were only 20-some million people in the United States. It was also a great bestseller in England. It had a tremendous impact across the North, and it provoked a tremendous reaction, a defensive reaction in many parts of the slave-holding South. Lincoln, there's so many apocryphal stories about Lincoln. I suppose that he did say that to Harriet Beecher Stowe, but even if he didn't, he could have. So you're the little lady who brought on this great war, or something like that. What that means is that her novel, I think, brought to the consciousness of many white Northerners issues relating to the institution of slavery that might not have been in their minds before that novel came out, and did so in a way that really engaged them at a level that just reading newspapers and so forth probably would not have.
So this all leads up to the 1860 campaign, in which there were how many presidential campaigns?
4 presidential candidates in 1860.
4 different parties?
Yes. Abraham Lincoln was the Republican. There was a regular Democratic nominee, Stephen A. Douglas, and then a Southern Democratic nominee named Breckinridge, who'd been Vice President of the United States under James Buchanan, and then a Constitutional Union Party that ran a candidate named John Bell.
You had southern states like South Carolina saying that if Abraham Lincoln were elected president, we're going to secede from the Union. You write that it was almost becoming the boy who cried wolf because they'd said this so often.
The next 3 hours is your chance to participate in a discussion with one of today's leading Civil War historians. Join us as Book TV's In Depth welcomes Gary Gallagher, professor in the history of the American Civil War at the University of Virginia. Professor Gallagher has been active in the preservation of Civil War battlefields and has written and edited dozens of books on the conflict.
Professor Gallagher, in addition to the books that you've edited and co-authored, you've written 6 books on the Civil War. What's the best way to study this battle?
For someone who's in the business, such as you mean, I think the best way to study it is to go to the original sources, to go to the manuscripts, to go to the letters and the diaries that people of the Civil War generation wrote, and then to go to the places where they acted out the war. I think a combination of those two approaches, I think, yield enormous insights into the conflict and into the era.
We have a lot of books that we want to talk to you about, but you brought along 2 that I want to ask you about right off the top. This National Geographic publication that came out in 1961.
Yes, that is an issue of National Geographic that anticipated the Civil War centennial. Came out in the spring of 1961. My grandmother had given me a subscription to the magazine, and I was captivated by the photographs and text in that article, pictures of some of the battlefields, woodcuts, prepared by some of the famous sketch artists of the time. It really caught my eye and gave me my first interest in the conflict.
Why?
I'm not sure why. I was living in southern Colorado. I had no ties to the Civil War. I have no family tie to the Civil War on either side of my family, but something about the images in that article started me on this road, and shortly after that I bought the book that you're holding now, which is the American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War. It came out in 1960. Has a text by Bruce Catton, who I think is the best of all the narrative writers who've written about the Civil War. And that book sealed my fate, so to speak. I became just hopelessly entranced with the war. I loved what are called picture maps in there, done by an artist named David Greenspan, picture maps of different battles. But just some of the images, the black and white photographs from the war, and some of the modern images of the places as they looked in 1960, together with Catton's wonderful text, made me engage the war in a way that I think I certainly never could have anticipated, or anyone who was around me. The Civil War wasn't a big topic in the part of Colorado where I grew up.
One of the pictures is from Fredericksburg, Virginia. How many photographs taken during the Civil War? How new was this technology back then?
Well, the technology wasn't brand new. There had been photographs for a couple of decades before the Civil War, but and there were photographs of the Crimean War. But the Civil War is the first intensively photographed war. I have no idea how many images were taken. I'm sure more than 1 million. Several 100,000 survive, at least. It is a much documented war by photographers, almost all working on the United States side. There were relatively very few photographers in the Confederacy, but it's and cameras could not take action pictures then. But if it's anything that wasn't in motion, the photographers almost certainly photographed it.
In one of the lectures that you'd given, and it's a 48-part series on the Civil War?
With the teaching company, yes.
Well, in one of the lectures, you talk about what was happening March 4th, 1865. President Lincoln is sworn into a second term. The 4th anniversary of the Civil War. 350,000 Union soldiers had died. Another 250,000 Confederate soldiers had died. Where were we as a country as he was preparing